My name is Soren Blackthorne. I'm a disaster communications expert who survived the first 48 hours of the zombie apocalypse. When a mysterious infection turned Phoenix into a nightmare, my skills became the difference between life and death. Every decision I made saved lives or cost them. This is how I kept 7 survivors alive when 4 million people turned into monsters. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. We broke camp before dawn, loading our vehicles under cover of darkness. Mike's group would head east toward the White Mountains, while we continued northeast toward the edge of the Navajo Nation. Before parting ways, we exchanged radio frequencies and recognition codes. If you make it to Vermilion Cliffs, broadcast on this frequency twice daily, Mike instructed, handing me a folded note with the details. We'll do the same from our location. Could be the start of a survivor network. Good luck, I told him, recognizing a kindred spirit, someone else who understood that long-term survival would depend on rebuilding connections between scattered survivor groups. Our vehicles moved out just as the eastern sky began to lighten. The desert landscape was transformed in the pre-dawn hour, rendered in shades of blue and gray. Visibility was limited, but sufficient for careful navigation, and the cooler temperatures meant the infected were less active. We maintained radio silence except for essential communications between our 2 SUVs. The military's increased air surveillance meant any transmission could potentially be detected. I wasn't certain they would target civilian survivors, but after what we'd learned about Operation Firestorm, I wasn't taking chances. The secondary roads were largely clear, though we occasionally encountered abandoned vehicles or evidence of hasty evacuations. Suitcases spilled across the pavement, personal belongings scattered by wind or scavengers. Each scene told a story of panic and desperate flight, reminding us how quickly society had collapsed. Around mid-morning, we approached the small town of Strawberry. Under normal circumstances, we would have bypassed it entirely, but our updated route required passage through the town to access the forest roads beyond. Dr. Reyes slowed the SUV as we reached the outskirts, and I scanned the area with binoculars. "I see movement," I reported. "At least a dozen infected near the main intersection, but something's different about them." The infected were gathered around what appeared to be a dead animal in the road. They weren't shambling aimlessly as we'd previously observed, but working with disturbing coordination to tear apart their find. "They're hunting together," Dr. Reyes observed, her voice clinically detached despite the horror of the implication. "Showing pack behavior." This development confirmed my earlier suspicion that the infection was evolving, adapting. The creatures were learning, or at least their basic instincts were becoming more refined. It made them significantly more dangerous. "We need another route," I decided, consulting the map. "There's a service road that circles the north edge of town. Longer, but safer." As Dr. Reyes carefully reversed, keeping the engine quiet, I radioed the information to Danny in the second vehicle. We backtracked half a mile to find the service road, a rough dirt track that wound through dense pine forest. The change of terrain from desert to forest was abrupt, creating new challenges and limited visibility. The forest road was barely wide enough for our vehicles, branches scraping against the sides as we navigated the uneven track. Progress was painfully slow, but the alternative, confronting the pack of infected in town, was unacceptable. An hour into the detour, the lead SUV's engine began to make an alarming knocking sound. Dr. Reyes pulled over and I popped the hood to investigate. Metal fragments in the oil suggested internal engine damage, likely from the rough terrain we'd been covering. "How bad?" Trevor asked, his accounting background giving him a practical appreciation for resource limitations. "Bad enough," I admitted. We can keep going for now, but the engine could fail completely without warning. This forced another difficult decision. We had planned to keep both vehicles as insurance against exactly this kind of problem, but now the damaged SUV was a liability rather than an asset. "We consolidate into one vehicle," I announced after consulting with Dr. Reyes. "Transfer all essential supplies. Leave behind anything we can replace." The process of transferring our equipment was tense, each of us constantly scanning the forest for movement. The sense of exposure was acute, heightened by the contrast between open desert and dense forest. Out here, an infected could be 10 feet away and invisible until it attacked. With all 7 of us plus equipment now crowded into Danny's SUV, comfort was sacrificed for mobility. We left the damaged vehicle hidden as best we could, removing the distributor cap to prevent anyone else from starting it easily. The extra fuel from its auxiliary tank was our most valuable salvage, extending our range significantly. "We should reach the eastern edge of the nation by nightfall," I noted, tracing our route on the map. "Then we'll have to make a decision about how to approach the military blockade." The mood in the vehicle was somber. The necessity of abandoning our backup transport made our vulnerability more apparent. We were now one mechanical failure away from being stranded in infected territory, with limited carrying capacity if we had to proceed on foot. As we continued northeast, the forest gradually thinned, returning to the familiar scrubland of the high desert. The openness brought better visibility, but also greater exposure. We maintained a vigilant watch for both infected and military patrols, aware that either could pose an existential threat. Around mid-afternoon, we crested a ridge and encountered a roadblock that wasn't on any of our maps. 3 vehicles were positioned across the road, civilian trucks rather than military, with armed individuals standing guard. A crude sign warned, "Quarantine border, stop or be shot." "Civilian checkpoint," I observed, studying them through binoculars. Not military, not bandits from what I can tell. Some kind of local self-defense group. "Do we turn back?" Danny asked from the driver's seat, hands tense on the steering wheel. I considered our options. Turning back meant more time in territory we knew was becoming increasingly dangerous. Going forward meant potential conflict with unknown actors. Neither choice was good. "We approach slowly," I decided. "I'll do the talking. Everyone else stay in the vehicle, but be ready for anything." Danny edged the SUV forward at walking pace. The guards at the roadblock raised their weapons, a mix of hunting rifles and shotguns, but held fire. I raised my hands to show we weren't hostile as we came to a stop 50 feet from their position. "That's close enough," called a woman in her 50s, clearly the leader based on how the others deferred to her. "State your business and where you're coming from." "We're passing through," I replied, keeping my hands visible. "Coming from Phoenix, heading northeast. 7 survivors. No one infected. No one bitten." "Phoenix?" Her expression hardened. "Phoenix is a dead zone. Nothing coming out of there but infected." "We got out early," I explained, "before the city was completely overrun. We've been on the move for 36 hours, avoiding population centers." She studied us suspiciously. "Open your vehicle. Everyone out where we can see them." I nodded to Danny, who opened all doors. Our group slowly exited, hands raised, forming a line beside the SUV. The checkpoint guards approached cautiously, weapons still trained on us. "I'm Ellen," the leader introduced herself, still maintaining a safe distance. "This is the border of safe territory. We've established a community of survivors spanning 3 towns. No one enters without clearance." "I'm Søren Blackthorne, disaster relief specialist," I replied, recognizing that my professional background might help our case. "This is Dr. Eliza Reyes, medical coordinator." Ellen's interest visibly increased at the mention of a doctor. A real MD, emergency medicine, Dr. Reyes confirmed. 15 years experience. A brief consultation among the checkpoint guards followed, their voices too low for us to hear. Finally, Ellen approached us again. "We need medical personnel," she admitted. "Lost our only doctor 2 days ago. Got overrun attending to patients in Payson." This created an opportunity, but also an ethical dilemma. We needed passage through their territory, but diverging from our plan to reach Vermilion Cliffs could cost lives in our group. Dr. Reyes made the decision before I could. "I can help your wounded provide training for basic medical care, in exchange for safe passage and supplies to continue our journey." Ellen considered this. "How do we know you're not infected?" "The early stages can be hard to detect." "We've been monitoring each other continuously," I explained. "The infection manifests within hours. None of us has shown any symptoms since leaving Phoenix." After further deliberation, Ellen agreed to escort us to their main settlement, a former resort complex near a small lake, now repurposed as a survivor community. The location was well chosen, with natural water supply, solar power from the resort's eco-friendly design, and easily defensible access roads. As we drove through their perimeter, I was impressed by what they'd accomplished in such a short time. Watchtowers had been constructed at strategic points. Gardens were already being planted. A rudimentary communications center operated from the resort's main building. Nearly 100 survivors had gathered here, organizing themselves into a functioning community. "How did you establish all this so quickly?" I asked Ellen as she showed us to the main lodge. "We started before the official emergency was declared," she explained. "Local emergency management had been tracking unusual reports for days. When things started going bad in Phoenix, our town manager implemented the crisis plan immediately, got people moving while there was still time. Their foresight was remarkable and lucky. Most communities had been caught completely unprepared with catastrophic results. We were assigned quarters in the resort's guest cabins after Dr. Reyes examined several injured survivors. As agreed, she provided medical assistance and training for their makeshift medical team, while I shared information about infection patterns and military movements. That evening, I was invited to their planning meeting, a gathering of individuals who had assumed leadership roles in the community. The resort's conference room had been transformed into an operations center with maps covering the walls and a radio communication setup in the corner. "We've been monitoring military frequencies," explained their communications specialist, a former ham radio enthusiast named Raj. "They're implementing Operation Firestorm at noon tomorrow. Based on their communications, it involves aerial incendiary deployment along specific containment lines. They're going to burn out the infection," I translated for the non-military people present. "Create fire breaks to stop infected movement." Ellen nodded grimly. "Our community falls just outside their eastern containment line. But the wind patterns this time of year could bring the fire right to us if it gets out of control." This information added new urgency to our journey. If the military was resorting to such extreme measures, the situation was deteriorating even faster than I had feared. "What's north of here?" I asked, studying their maps. "Is there a clear route to the Utah border?" "Theoretically," Raj replied, tracing a path with his finger. "But we've lost contact with every community north of the Mogollon Rim. Could be communication failures. Could be they're all gone." "What about Vermilion Cliffs Research Station?" I pressed. "Have you had any contact?" The group exchanged glances. "We picked up automated broadcasts," Ellen finally answered. "They've sealed themselves in. Limited access, strict quarantine protocols. You'd need proper clearance to get anywhere near them." "I have clearance," I assured her, though I wasn't entirely certain my disaster relief credentials would still carry weight in the new reality. "And information they'll need about how the infection is spreading." The meeting continued late into the night with detailed discussions of resource management, defense strategies, and communication protocols. Despite our plan to continue north in the morning, I found myself drawn into their planning process, offering insights from my disaster relief experience. "You could stay," Ellen suggested as the meeting concluded. "Both of you. Dr. Reyes would be invaluable, and your expertise in crisis management could help us build something sustainable here." The offer was tempting. Their community showed remarkable potential for long-term survival. They had water, food production capability, defensible position, and most importantly, effective leadership. The comparative certainty of joining them weighed against the dangerous journey to Vermilion Cliffs with no guarantee of acceptance upon arrival. But I thought of the transmission we'd intercepted. Vermilion Station secure. Limited capacity. The research station had resources and infrastructure that could prove crucial not just for survival, but for understanding and potentially combating the infection. My responsibility extended beyond just keeping our small group alive. We carried information that might help the broader fight against whatever this was. "We need to continue north," I told Ellen, "but we'll establish communication protocols before leaving. If you maintain a regular broadcast schedule, we can exchange information once we reach our destination." She accepted my decision with a nod of respect. "We'll provide what supplies we can spare, and an escort to the northern boundary of our territory." That night, as I updated my journal in the quiet of our borrowed cabin, I found myself reflecting on how quickly humans adapt to the unthinkable. In just 36 hours, we had adjusted to a world where the dead walked, where civilization had largely collapsed, where survival depended on skills most people had never needed to develop. Dr. Reyes joined me, having finished treating the community's injured. "They've offered us permanent places here," she mentioned, clearly having received the same invitation. "We could stop running." "Is that what you want?" I asked, curious about her perspective. Despite working closely together for years, the crisis had revealed depths to her character I hadn't fully appreciated before. "Part of me does," she admitted. "They need medical expertise desperately. I could save lives here, make a real difference." She paused, looking out the window at the community's patrol lights. "But they're already establishing themselves. At Vermilion Cliffs, we might find resources to understand this infection, maybe even find a way to stop it." Her scientific curiosity balanced her healer's instinct, exactly the combination we needed for the challenges ahead. "We leave at dawn," I confirmed, closing my journal. "The military operation tomorrow changes everything. We need to be well clear of this area before they start the burns." As we prepared for a few hours of much-needed rest, the radio in the corner of the cabin crackled to life. Raj's voice came through, tense but controlled. "Perimeter breach at the east gate. Multiple infected approaching from the forest. All available personnel report for defense duty." Our brief respite had ended. The infected had found the community, just as they eventually found every concentration of survivors. The coming hours would test the defenses Ellen and her people had established, and would determine whether we could continue our journey north as planned. The apocalypse waited for no one, and dawn was still hours away. I grabbed my pack and the fire axe that had become my constant companion. Dr. Reyes already had her medical kit in hand. Without discussion, we both knew we couldn't stay safely in the cabin while others defended the perimeter. "Head to the command center," I told our group, who had been awakened by the alert. "Stay together and follow Ellen's protocols. Danny, make sure our vehicle is ready for immediate departure if necessary." Outside, the community had mobilized with impressive efficiency. Teams moved toward defensive positions, carrying weapons and communication equipment. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter, revealing the approaching threat. Through binoculars, I counted at least 30 infected moving through the trees toward the eastern gate. Their movement pattern confirmed what we'd observed earlier. not the random shambling of individual infected, but coordinated group behavior. They were functioning like pack predators, converging on the settlement from multiple angles. Ellen was directing the defense from a raised platform near the gate, using hand signals to position her people. I approached, offering my assistance. "They've never come in these numbers before," she said grimly. "Usually just stragglers or small groups we can pick off before they reach the fence." "They're evolving," I explained, "learning rudimentary pack hunting behavior. Have you noticed increased activity after dark?" "Yes," she confirmed. "More organized, more persistent. Started about 36 hours ago." That time frame aligned with our observations, suggesting the change in behavior was widespread rather than localized. I shared this information while helping position defenders along the fence line. "Noise and light discipline," I advised, drawing on tactical knowledge from disaster zones with security concerns. "They're drawn to both. Minimize unnecessary sound. Direct lights outward only to blind them without illuminating targets inside the perimeter." The community's defense plan was solid but conventional, based on assumptions about infected behavior that were rapidly becoming outdated. The creatures approaching the fence weren't mindless zombies from fiction. They were adapting, developing new strategies based on innate predatory instincts unleashed by the infection. "They're testing different sections," I observed, watching several infected probing the fence at widely separated points. "Looking for weaknesses." Ellen immediately redirected some of her people to reinforce vulnerable areas. The defensive perimeter held as the first wave of infected reached the fence, hands grasping through the chain links, mouths snapping uselessly at the air. The defenders used spears and poles to keep the infected at a safe distance while conserving ammunition. Sound discipline was maintained with no unnecessary shouting or communication. But despite their preparation, I could see the fear on people's faces, the horrible recognition as they identified neighbors, friends, and family members among the attacking infected. "Southeast corner is reporting increased pressure," came a voice through Ellen's radio. "Fence starting to bow inward." "Redirect Team 2 for support," she ordered calmly, though I could see the strain in her expression. "Authorized use of firearms if breach appears imminent." I moved to the threatened section with several defenders, bringing additional support poles to reinforce the bending fence. The infected on this side had concentrated their efforts, pushing collectively against a single point. The strategy was disturbingly intelligent. "They're cooperating," Dr. Reyes observed, having followed me to offer medical support if needed. "Using combined force rather than individual efforts." As we worked to strengthen the fence, I spotted movement in the trees beyond the perimeter lights. More infected approaching, at least 20 additional figures emerging from the darkness. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. "We need a diversion," I told Ellen when she arrived to assess the situation. "Something to draw them away from this corner before the fence fails." She considered for only a moment before nodding. "The emergency siren at the old fire station, it's half a mile east on a timer system. We can trigger it remotely." "Do it," I agreed. "But be ready for them to return once it stops. They have short attention spans, but persistent hunting instincts." Ellen gave the order, and moments later a distant, wailing siren cut through the night. The effect on the infected was immediate and dramatic. Almost as one, they turned toward the sound, abandoning their assault on the fence to move toward the new stimulus. "Reinforce all sections now, while we have time," Ellen commanded. Her people moved quickly, adding support struts and securing weak points in the perimeter. As the infected disappeared into the darkness drawn by the siren, a palpable relief spread through the defenders. But I knew it was temporary at best. The hunting pattern we'd observed suggested they would return once the siren stopped, possibly with even more of their kind. "We need to leave," I told Dr. Reyes quietly. "When the diversion ends, They'll be back in greater numbers. This location isn't secure enough against the new behavior patterns. She nodded, understanding the implications. I'll coordinate with Danny to prepare the vehicle. The others should be at the command center. I approached Ellen, who was directing reinforcement efforts around the perimeter. Your community needs to consider evacuation, I advised. This type of attack will only become more frequent and better coordinated. The infection is driving an evolutionary adaptation toward pack-hunting behavior. Evacuate to where? She asked, frustration evident in her voice. This is the most defensible position we've found. We have water, growing food capacity, solar power. Underground, I suggested. Basement levels, maintenance tunnels, anywhere without windows or multiple access points. The infected can learn to push against fences, but they can't operate complex mechanisms or break through reinforced concrete. Ellen considered this, mentally mapping the resort's infrastructure. The maintenance levels below the main building, storage areas, utility tunnels, limited access points we could fortify. Exactly, I confirmed. Move essential supplies there immediately. Create a fallback position at minimum, with capacity to house everyone if necessary. While Ellen mobilized teams to begin the process, I gathered our group at the SUV. Everyone was present except Melissa, who had remained at the command center to help coordinate communications. I'll get her, Trevor volunteered, heading back toward the main building. Dr. Reyes had secured additional medical supplies from the community's stores with Ellen's blessing. Danny had filled the vehicle's tank completely and acquired an additional fuel can. We were as prepared as possible for the next stage of our journey. 10 minutes passed with no sign of Trevor or Melissa. The distant siren had fallen silent, and I knew the infected would soon return, possibly approaching from multiple directions this time. I'll find them, I decided, taking the fire axe in my pack. Be ready to move as soon as we return. The command center was in controlled chaos when I arrived. Defenders reporting from various sectors, Ellen's people implementing the new underground strategy, equipment being relocated to the basement levels. I spotted Trevor helping Melissa gather maps and communication equipment. We need to go now, I told them. The diversion has ended. Almost done, Melissa replied, securing a portable radio set. These frequencies might help us contact Vermilion Cliffs. Before I could respond, a shout came from outside, followed by the crack of gunfire. Through the windows I saw infected pouring from the tree line. Far more than before, at least 50, moving with coordinated purpose toward the perimeter. They brought reinforcements, Trevor observed, his voice steady despite the clear fear in his eyes. The community's defense teams rushed to their positions, but I could already see sections of the fence beginning to fail under the collective pressure of dozens of infected pushing against it. Back exit, I ordered, guiding Trevor and Melissa toward the rear of the building. We need to reach the vehicle now. We moved through service corridors, avoiding the main areas where defenders were mobilizing. Through windows, I caught glimpses of the perimeter defense collapsing, infected breaking through in multiple locations, defenders falling back toward the main buildings. They're inside the fence, I reported grimly as we reached a rear exit. We have a small window to reach the vehicle before they cut off our escape route. Outside, the night had descended into chaos. Gunfire echoed across the compound as defenders tried to hold back the swarm of infected. Emergency lights cast harsh shadows across the grounds, creating a disorienting landscape of movement and danger. Our SUV was parked 50 yards away, near the guest cabins where we'd been staying. Dr. Reyes had positioned it for quick departure, facing the access road that led away from the resort. Move together, stay low, don't run unless absolutely necessary, I instructed. They're attracted to rapid movement. We advanced cautiously, using buildings for cover whenever possible. Halfway to the vehicle, 3 infected appeared around the corner of a cabin, immediately zeroing in on our movement. They charged with that unnatural speed they displayed when hunting detected prey. I positioned myself between them and my companions. "Get to the vehicle," I called to Trevor and Melissa. "I'll hold them here." The first infected reached me, a man who had once been a resort staff member based on his tattered uniform. I swung the axe in a controlled arc, aiming for the leg rather than the head or torso. The blade connected, severing tendons and bringing him down without killing him. These had been people once. I still couldn't bring myself to deliver killing blows unless absolutely necessary. The second and third attacked simultaneously. I managed to knock one back with the axe handle, but the other, a woman in hiking clothes, grasped my jacket. Her teeth snapped inches from my arm as I struggled to break her grip. Trevor appeared suddenly beside me, wielding a metal pipe he'd found somewhere. He struck the infected woman with enough force to break her hold, allowing me to step back and create space between us and the creatures. "Thanks," I gasped, regaining my balance. "Now run." We sprinted the remaining distance to the SUV, infected from multiple directions converging on our movement. Dr. Reyes had the engine running, doors open and waiting. We piled in, slamming the doors shut as infected hands slapped against the windows. "Drive," I ordered, catching my breath as Danny navigated through groups of infected toward the access road. "Head north. Follow the route we discussed." Behind us, the resort was being overrun. Defenders retreated toward the main building, implementing the fallback plan to the underground levels. I could only hope Ellen and her people would reach safety before the infected overwhelmed them completely. "We should help them," Melissa argued, watching the chaos recede in the rear window. "We can't," I replied firmly. "Not without sacrificing ourselves for nothing. The best way to help is to reach Vermilion Cliffs and establish a communication network among survivor groups. Share information about how the infected are evolving." The weight of that decision hung heavily in the vehicle as we reached the main road and accelerated north. The resort's lights diminished behind us, occasionally punctuated by muzzle flashes as the defenders continued their desperate stand. I checked everyone for injuries or bites, a standard protocol I'd established after every encounter with infected. No one was hurt, but the psychological impact was evident in their expressions. Witnessing a well-organized community fall so quickly had shaken their confidence in any possibility of safety. "They had everything right," Trevor said quietly. "Defenses, supplies, organization, and it still wasn't enough. They weren't prepared for the infected to change tactics," I explained, documenting the attack pattern in my journal. "None of us were. This adaptive behavior suggests the infection is more complex than we initially thought." Dr. Reyes nodded grimly. "The neurological effects appear to be evolving. Initial infection destroys higher brain functions but leaves basic motor control and instinctual behaviors intact. Now we're seeing emergent coordination between infected individuals, almost like a hive mind developing. The implications were terrifying. If the infected continued to develop more sophisticated hunting strategies, even the most secure locations might eventually fall. Our destination at Vermilion Cliffs might only offer temporary safety rather than long-term security. We drove through the night, maintaining a cautious speed and vigilant watch for both infected and military checkpoints. The lack of functioning traffic signals or street lighting made navigation challenging, but also provided cover from potential aerial surveillance. Around 2 a.m, a concerning sound emerged from the SUV's engine, a rhythmic knocking that suggested mechanical problems. "Pull over when you find a secure location," I instructed Danny. "We need to check this before it becomes critical." 5 miles later, we located a roadside scenic overlook with good visibility in all directions. Danny stopped the vehicle, and I popped the hood to investigate. "Timing belt is starting to fail," I diagnosed after a brief examination. "We can keep going for now, But it's going to get worse. How much farther to the military blockade? Trevor asked, consulting the map with a flashlight. About 60 miles, I estimated. At our current pace, we'll reach it shortly after dawn. And if the vehicle fails before then? Melissa asked, voicing the concern everyone shared. We proceed on foot, I replied matter-of-factly. Take only essential supplies, establish a rendezvous protocol in case we get separated. The prospect of continuing without transportation was daunting. On foot, we would be more vulnerable to both infected and exposure. The desert environment was unforgiving, with extreme temperature fluctuations and limited water sources. After a brief rest and engine check, we continued northward. The rhythm of travel had taken on a surreal quality, periods of tense vigilance interrupted by moments of immediate danger, then back to the grinding routine of survival. Time seemed simultaneously compressed and expanded, hours feeling like minutes during crises and like days during the quieter stretches. As we approached a small town called Winslow, the eastern sky began to lighten. Dawn was still an hour away, but the faint glow provided just enough visibility to make out shapes along the roadside. What I saw caused me to signal Danny to stop immediately. The road ahead was blocked by vehicles, not abandoned in panic like those we'd seen before, but deliberately positioned as a barricade. The systematic arrangement suggested military, but something felt wrong about the setup. There were no visible personnel, no checkpoint structures, no signs or warnings. Stay here, I instructed, taking the binoculars from my pack. I'll scout ahead on foot. Moving carefully through the desert brush alongside the road, I approached close enough to examine the barricade properly. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't a military checkpoint at all. The vehicles had been arranged to create the appearance of an official blockade, but they were civilian models with crude military markings painted on their sides. More disturbing were the signs of recent violence. Bloodstains darkened the pavement around the vehicles. Shell casings glinted in the pre-dawn light. And behind the barricade, partially hidden from the road, several bodies lay motionless, but they weren't infected. These people had been shot, execution style, their hands bound behind their backs. I retreated quickly, returning to our vehicle with the grim news. It's an ambush site. Someone's been posing as military, stopping travelers and killing them. Bandits? Trevor suggested, his expression hardening. Worse, I replied. Based on the setup, they're deliberately creating a choke point, probably telling survivors the road ahead is clear. They take supplies, vehicles, weapons, then eliminate witnesses. The discovery forced us to reconsider our entire route. If false checkpoints were being established, we couldn't rely on any of the information we'd received about safe passage north. Every crossroads, every bridge, every natural bottleneck could conceal similar traps. We need to get off the main roads completely, I decided, studying the map. There's a network of ranch roads and fire breaks that runs parallel to our route. Rougher terrain, but less likely to be monitored or ambushed. The engine's knocking had worsened during our brief stop, the sound now more pronounced and concerning. I estimated we had perhaps 50 miles before mechanical failure became inevitable. We'll use the vehicle as long as possible, I told the group. Then cache supplies at regular intervals as we continue on foot. Dawn broke as we navigated carefully around the false checkpoint, using an old dirt road that served neighboring ranches. The increasing light revealed a landscape seemingly untouched by the catastrophe unfolding across the country. Peaceful desert scrubland stretching to distant mesas, the morning sky painted in brilliant oranges and pinks. But the beauty was deceptive. In the 40 hours since the infection had first emerged, human civilization had begun to collapse. Not just from the infected themselves, but from the breakdown of the social contracts that governed interaction. Law, order, cooperation, all were crumbling as rapidly as the physical infrastructure. And we were still more than 100 miles from Vermilion Cliffs. The dirt roads took us through ranch land that appeared deserted, with no signs of either human presence or infected activity. The isolation should have been comforting, but instead created a growing sense of unease. The complete absence of life, not even livestock in the fields, suggested either mass evacuation or something worse. The military containment operation must have included this area, Dr. Reyes observed as we passed an abandoned ranch house. Forced evacuation ahead of their quarantine line. That theory made sense, but didn't explain the complete absence of infected. If the evacuation had occurred after the outbreak reached this region, we should have encountered at least some wandering infected. Their absence suggested a more systematic clearing operation. Our vehicle struggled increasingly with the rough terrain, the engine knock growing louder with each mile. Around mid-morning, it finally gave out completely, leaving us stranded in the high desert about 15 miles east of Winslow. "End of the road," I announced, hiding my concern behind practical focus. "We salvage what we can carry and continue on foot." I had prepared for this possibility, creating prioritized equipment lists and assigning specific items to each person based on their physical capacity. We abandoned non-essential items, focusing on water, food concentrates, medical supplies, navigation equipment, and weapons. "Each person carries 3 days of water minimum," I instructed, distributing the bottles we'd collected. "We ration starting now, regardless of thirst level. 4 ounces every hour during daylight, 2 ounces during cooler periods." The brutal arithmetic of survival in desert conditions left no room for comfort or preference. Without the vehicle's capacity to carry supplies, our margin for error had vanished completely. "What's our realistic range on foot?" Trevor asked, the accountant in him calculating our new limitations. 15 miles per day in this terrain if we push hard, I estimated. Less if we encounter difficulties or need to detour around danger areas. That meant at least a week to reach Vermilion Cliffs, if everything went perfectly. The reality would likely be much slower progress and greater water consumption than planned. "There's a ranger station marked on the map," I continued, pointing to a location about 12 miles northeast of our position. "Potential water source and shelter for tonight. We head there first." We disguised the abandoned SUV as best we could, concealing it under brush to prevent it from attracting attention from either hostile survivors or military patrols. I disabled the engine completely, removing key components to prevent anyone else from salvaging it easily. Before departing, I used the vehicle's elevated position to survey our surroundings through binoculars. The landscape appeared empty in all directions, but a thin column of smoke rose from the vicinity of Winslow to the west, evidence of Operation Firestorm beginning as scheduled. "We need to move," I urged, noting the time. "The controlled burns will drive any infected in the area eastward, directly into our path." Our group formed a walking line, with Danny on point using her navigation skills, me in second position watching for threats, the others spaced evenly behind, and Dr. Reyes taking the rearguard position. The formation maximized visibility while maintaining communication capability through the line. The August sun beat down mercilessly as we hiked across the high desert. Despite the water rationing and regular rest periods in whatever shade we could find, heat exhaustion became a growing concern. Trevor, in particular, struggled with the pace, his office-bound physique not conditioned for extended hiking with a heavy pack. "I need to stop," he gasped during our 4th hour of travel, face flushed and sweating profusely despite the dry air. "Just for a minute." Dr. Reyes was at his side immediately, checking his pulse and pupil dilation. "Early heat exhaustion," she diagnosed. "We need to cool him down and hydrate more aggressively, or he'll deteriorate quickly." I consulted the map, looking for any potential shelter. We were still at least 6 miles from the ranger station, with minimal natural shade in the surrounding terrain. There's a dry wash about half a mile ahead, I noted, identifying a depression in the landscape that might offer some protection from the direct sun. We'll rest there until the worst heat passes, then continue in the evening. The decision to delay worried me. Every hour increased the likelihood of encountering infected driven east by the controlled burns. But pushing Trevor further in his condition would likely result in a medical emergency we couldn't adequately address in the field. We reached the wash, a shallow ravine carved by seasonal water flow, now bone dry but offering precious shade under its embankment. Dr. Reyes immediately set to work cooling Trevor with dampened cloths while carefully administering additional water. The rest of us established a perimeter watch, scanning the horizon for movement while conserving energy. "What do you think happened to Ellen's group?" Melissa asked quietly as we shared our shade spot. "Do you think they made it to the underground sections?" I considered the question carefully before answering. False hope served no purpose in survival situations, but neither did unnecessary despair. "Some of them likely made it," I replied honestly. Ellen was implementing the fallback plan as we left, and she had capable people. The underground areas would provide significant protection if properly secured. Melissa nodded, seemingly satisfied with the assessment. Like all of us, she was processing the psychological impact of witnessing social collapse firsthand. The communities and structures we had taken for granted our entire lives had proven shockingly fragile. As the afternoon progressed, I documented our situation in my journal, recording water consumption, physical condition of each group member, and environmental observations. The methodical process helped maintain my focus and provided crucial data for future decision-making. Around 4 in the afternoon, with the sun's intensity finally diminishing, we prepared to resume our journey. Trevor had recovered sufficiently to continue, though Dr. Reyes insisted on redistributing some of his pack weight among the rest of us. Just as we were about to depart, Danny, who had taken an elevated position on the washbank, signaled for silence. She pointed west, toward the direction we had come from. Through my binoculars, I observed what had caught her attention: movement on the horizon, multiple figures advancing across the desert in our general direction. "How many?" Dr. Reyes whispered when I lowered the binoculars. "At least 20, possibly more," I replied grimly. "Moving with purpose, not random wandering." "Infected?" Trevor asked, his face paling. "Most likely," I confirmed, "driven east by the controlled burns, just as I feared." The timing couldn't have been worse. With several hours of daylight remaining, we couldn't simply hide and wait for darkness. The infected were moving directly toward our position, perhaps drawn by our earlier movement or simply following the path of least resistance through the desert terrain. "Options?" Danny asked, practical as always. I evaluated our situation rapidly. The wash provides some concealment, but no real protection if they find us. We need to reach more defensible terrain before they close the distance. Consulting the map, I identified a rocky outcropping about 2 miles northeast of our position, a formation of weathered sandstone that might provide both cover and elevated positions for defense if necessary. We move now, I decided, quiet, steady pace. Use the wash for concealment as long as possible, then cross the open ground to the rocks. If they detect us, we don't run unless absolutely necessary. Rapid movement draws their attention more than steady progression. The group nodded, accepting the plan without argument. In the 40 hours since leaving Phoenix, they had adapted remarkably to crisis decision-making, trusting the assessments of those with relevant expertise rather than wasting time with debate. We moved through the wash as it curved northeast, using its depth for concealment while maintaining a steady pace. The infected were still at least a mile behind us, but moving with that unsettling coordination we had observed at Ellen's compound. They weren't shambling individually, but advancing as a loose pack, maintaining roughly similar spacing and direction. When the wash veered west, we were forced to leave its protection and cross open desert toward the rocky outcropping. This was the most dangerous part of our maneuver, nearly a mile of exposed terrain with no cover and limited speed due to Trevor's condition. Steady pace, maintain formation, minimize noise, I reminded everyone as we began the crossing. If they spot us, we continue to the rocks without panicking. The next 30 minutes were some of the most tense of our journey. Crossing the open desert under the late afternoon sun, constantly aware of the advancing infected behind us, unable to move faster without risking Trevor's health deteriorating again. I found myself counting steps, focusing on the rhythm of movement to manage the growing anxiety. Halfway to the outcropping, Melissa spotted another concern, a separate group of infected approaching from the north, about a dozen in number. Their appearance confirmed my fear that the military's containment operation was driving infected from multiple directions into our path. Don't react visibly, I instructed when she alerted us. Maintain course and speed. Any change in our movement pattern will draw their attention more quickly. The psychological pressure was immense. Every instinct screamed to run for the rocks, but discipline and experience told me that steady, deliberate movement was our best strategy. The infected were primarily attracted to rapid motion and loud sounds. Calm progression might allow us to reach safety before they detected us. We were 300 yards from the outcropping when the group behind us changed course, turning directly toward our position. They had spotted us. "They've got our scent," Dr. Reyes observed clinically. "Do we run now?" "Not yet," I replied, watching their approach carefully. "They're still far enough that running would expend energy we might need for climbing the rocks. Increase pace slightly, but steadily." The distance closed with excruciating slowness. The infected behind us moved with alarming speed across the open terrain, while the northern group had also adjusted course to intercept our path. It became a race calculable in minutes and yards. Would we reach the defensible position before they reached us? 200 yards from safety, Trevor stumbled, nearly falling before Danny caught his arm. The momentary disruption in our movement immediately drew increased attention from the pursuing infected, who accelerated toward us. "Now we run," I commanded, abandoning the measured approach. "Directly to the rocks. Danny and I will help Trevor." The final sprint to the outcropping pushed everyone to their limits. Danny and I half-carried Trevor between us, maintaining barely enough speed to stay ahead of the closest infected. Dr. Reyes and Melissa reached the rocks first, quickly finding a defensible path up the sandstone formation. "This way," Melissa called, identifying a narrow crevice that led to higher ground. We reached the base of the rocks just as the first infected closed to within 50 yards. The formation's steep sides provided natural protection, with only a few viable climbing routes that could be more easily defended. We scrambled upward through the crevice, helping Trevor navigate the difficult terrain. From an elevated position 20 feet up, I turned to assess the threat. Both groups of infected had converged at the base of the rocks, prowling around the perimeter seeking access. Their behavior showed that unsettling intelligence again, not blindly attacking the stone, but actively searching for climbing routes. "They're problem-solving," Dr. Reyes noted, watching their methodical examination of the rock face. "Testing different approaches." One infected, a woman in torn hiking clothes, began ascending a route on the far side of the formation. Others quickly followed, demonstrating that disturbing pack mentality. They weren't fast climbers, their coordination impaired by the infection, but they were persistent. "We need to secure this position," I decided, scanning the top of the outcropping. "Find defensive points covering all potential access routes." The rocky summit formed a rough plateau about 30 yards across, with excellent visibility in all directions. We positioned ourselves to monitor the 3 viable climbing routes, using loose rocks as ready projectiles to dislodge any infected that made significant progress upward. As darkness approached, the infected continued their relentless attempts to reach us. Their climbing abilities were limited, but their persistence was unnerving. Whenever one found partial success on a route, others would immediately follow, learning from the first's progress. "They shouldn't be able to do this," Trevor said, watching their behavior with horrified fascination. "This level of adaptation isn't possible in 2 days. The infection must be affecting the brain in ways we don't understand," Dr. Reyes replied, "destroying higher functions but enhancing certain instinctual behaviors, perhaps even creating a rudimentary hive mind through chemical signaling." That possibility was more frightening than anything we'd encountered. If the infected were truly developing collective intelligence, even primitive, then secure locations would become increasingly vulnerable over time as they learned to overcome defenses. Night fell completely, bringing new challenges. Without artificial light, we could only track the infected by sound. The scrape of hands on rock, the low moaning that seemed to communicate between them, the occasional fall when one lost its grip. We established a rotation of watch positions, maintaining vigilance over each approach route. During my watch shift, I updated my journal by the dim light of a covered flashlight, documenting the evolved behaviors we'd observed. If we reached Vermilion Cliffs, this information could prove crucial for understanding the infection's progression and developing more effective containment strategies. Around midnight, the activity below suddenly diminished. The moaning and movement sounds decreased dramatically, as if the infected had lost interest or moved on. I didn't trust the apparent retreat. It seemed too coordinated, too convenient. "They're still there," Danny confirmed when she returned from checking the perimeter. "Just being quiet. Almost like they're waiting for something." The strategic patience was perhaps the most disturbing evolution yet. These weren't mindless zombies from fiction. They were becoming calculating predators with primitive but effective hunting strategies. As we maintained our vigilant watch through the night, I contemplated our situation with brutal honesty. We were trapped on a rock formation with limited water, no shelter from the elements, and surrounded by infected demonstrating increasingly sophisticated behavior. The ranger station that had been our original destination was still miles away, and our path there would take us directly through the infected concentration below. For the first time since the crisis began, I found myself questioning whether any of us would survive to reach Vermilion Cliffs. The infected were adapting faster than we could respond, developing new strategies that counteracted our advantages of intelligence and planning. If the trend continued, even the most secure facilities might eventually fall, but giving in to despair would guarantee failure. I forced myself to focus on immediate concerns: conserving water through the night, maintaining watch rotations, preparing for whatever new challenge dawn might bring. Survival wasn't about grand strategies at this point, just solving one problem at a time, hour by hour. As the eastern sky began to lighten, revealing the landscape in gradually increasing detail, I made a disturbing discovery. The infected hadn't retreated during the night, they had gathered reinforcements. Nearly 50 now surrounded our position, far more than the original groups we had evaded. They stood in eerie stillness, watching the outcropping with unnervingly focused attention. This wasn't random behavior or coincidence. They had deliberately converged on our location, perhaps communicating our presence to others through means we didn't understand. The implications were chilling. Not only were they learning to coordinate their attacks, they were actively sharing information about prey locations. "We have a serious problem," I told the group as everyone awoke to the new situation. "They've surrounded us completely, and in greater numbers than we can possibly evade on open ground." Trevor stared at the assembled infected with naked fear. "So we're trapped here?" "Until we run out of water." "No," I replied firmly. "We need a diversion." something significant enough to draw them away long enough for us to reach better terrain. Dr. Reyes considered the problem with her characteristic analytical approach. Fire would draw their attention. They consistently move away from it based on what we observed with the controlled burns. But we don't have enough combustible material up here to create a significant fire, Melissa pointed out. I studied the landscape, looking for any opportunity we could exploit. About a mile to the east, a small structure was visible, perhaps a maintenance shed or pump house for ranch operations. If we could reach that building, I said, pointing it out, we might find materials to create a diversion. The question is how to get there with 50 infected between us and it. Danny had been unusually quiet, studying the infected with intense focus. I've been watching their movement patterns, she finally said. They respond most strongly to sound first, then movement. But they seem to have difficulty tracking multiple stimuli simultaneously. Her observation aligned with my own notes about their behavior. Despite their evolving coordination, the infected still had limitations imposed by the neurological damage of the infection. So we need multiple distractions, I concluded, separated in both time and space, to create confusion in their response pattern. Together, we formulated a plan using the limited resources available to us. The success of our escape would depend entirely on timing and the accurate prediction of infected behavior based on our observations. There was no margin for error, no backup option if the plan failed. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, we prepared to implement our strategy. The infected remained in their unsettling vigil around the outcropping, waiting with inhuman patience for any opportunity to reach us. They had already demonstrated problem-solving abilities. It seemed only a matter of time before they found a way up the rock face that we couldn't counter. Our very survival now depended on whether we had correctly analyzed their behavioral patterns and whether we could exploit the limitations of their evolving intelligence before it evolved further. Our plan had 3 phases, each dependent on precise timing and execution. First, we prepared 4 noise distractions using the limited resources we had. Alarm functions on watches set to trigger at specific intervals, placed at different locations around the outcropping. Second, we created visual distractions by rigging Trevor's brightly colored shirt to flutter in the wind from one side of the rocks. Finally, we identified our escape route, a narrow path down the northwest face that offered the most cover and quickest access to the open terrain toward the distant structure. "Everyone understand their role?" I asked as we made final preparations. The group nodded, faces tense but determined. Despite their civilian backgrounds, they had adapted remarkably to crisis thinking over the past 40 hours. "Timing is everything," I emphasized. "Once the sequence begins, move exactly as planned. No hesitation, no deviation." The first watch alarm activated on the eastern side of the outcropping, its high-pitched beeping immediately drawing the attention of nearby infected. As they moved toward the sound, we carefully positioned the shirt distraction on the southern face, letting it snap in the morning breeze. The visual stimulus pulled more infected away from our planned exit route. "Second alarm in 30 seconds, I whispered, watching the infected closely. Their behavior confirmed Danny's observation. They struggled to process multiple stimuli, becoming visibly disoriented when forced to choose between competing attractions. When the second alarm sounded, the infected nearest to it immediately changed direction, creating momentary chaos as the pack behavior broke down into individual responses. This was our window. "Now," I signaled, leading the way down our escape route. We moved as quietly as possible, controlling our descent to minimize noise and sudden movements. The infected below remained focused on the alarms, their attention split between competing stimuli. We reached the base of the outcropping on the northwest side, still undetected by the majority of the horde. The third alarm activated as planned, drawing even more infected away from our position. Only a few remained dangerously close to our path, but they were oriented away from us, their limited perception focused on the various distractions. "Stay low, move steady, maintain spacing," I instructed in the barest whisper. "Head directly for the structure to the east." We crossed the open ground in a crouched run, using the morning shadows to maximum advantage. The final alarm triggered when we were halfway across, creating the chaotic response pattern we had hoped for. The infected milled around the outcropping in confusion, some climbing toward the sound sources, others circling aimlessly, their rudimentary coordination temporarily disrupted. By some miracle of timing and planning, we reached the distant structure without being detected. It was a small maintenance building for water pumping equipment, its metal door secured with a simple padlock. I broke it open with my fire axe and we slipped inside, closing the door behind us just as some of the infected began to move in our direction, perhaps sensing our escape. "They'll figure it out soon," I warned, scanning the interior of the building for anything useful. "We need to create our next diversion quickly." The pump house contained basic maintenance equipment, tools, and most valuably, several containers of fuel for the backup generator. We worked rapidly to gather what we needed, knowing that the infected would soon converge on our location once they realized their prey had escaped the outcropping. "Fuel, tools, some rope," Trevor inventoried, his accounting background making him naturally organized despite the stress. "Enough to create a significant distraction." "Water," Melissa added, pointing to a supply tank in the corner. "We can refill our bottles." This unexpected resource was perhaps the most valuable find. Our water supplies had dwindled during our night on the rocks, and dehydration in the desert environment would kill us as surely as the infected. Dr. Reyes refilled our water containers while Danny and I formulated the next phase of our plan. The pump house itself was not defensible long-term. A single door, no alternate exits, windows too small for escape. We needed to move on quickly, but the open terrain offered little protection or concealment. "The ranger station is still our best option," I decided, studying the map. "About 7 miles northeast from here. If we can create a significant enough diversion, we might reach it before they can regroup." Outside, the infected had begun to approach the building, their initial confusion giving way to renewed hunting behavior. Scraping sounds at the door and windows indicated they had tracked us to the pump house. We had minutes at most before they found a way in. We prepared our diversion using the generator fuel and maintenance materials. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Create a fire large enough to draw the infected away, allowing us to escape in the opposite direction. The risk was significant. If the fire spread in the dry conditions, it could potentially trap us or draw military attention to our location. "Last resort," I acknowledged when Dr. Reyes expressed concern. "But we're out of options and time." The scraping at the door intensified, metal hinges beginning to bend under the collective pressure of multiple infected pushing against it. Through the small windows I could see dozens more approaching from the direction of the outcropping. They had definitely tracked our movement. "Ready?" I asked, receiving tense nods from everyone. We positioned our improvised fire starter at the far corner of the building, rigged to ignite with a delayed mechanism giving us precious seconds to exit through the door. When everything was prepared, we gathered at the entrance, ready to sprint northwest away from both the fire and the main concentration of infected. "On my count," I said, hand on the door latch. 3, 2, 1. I yanked the door open, immediately knocking back 2 infected who had been pressing against it. We burst out as a group, using momentum and surprise to break through the initial ring of creatures surrounding the building. I swung the fire axe in controlled arcs, creating space rather than trying to kill, while the others followed closely behind. 20 yards from the building, our delayed ignition triggered. The fuel caught immediately, fire engulfing the corner of the pump house with impressive intensity. The effect on the infected was immediate and dramatic. They recoiled from the flames, their hunting focus disrupted by the primal fear of fire that apparently remained even after the infection destroyed higher brain functions. We ran northwest as the fire spread quickly across the dry wooden structure. The infected around the building scattered in confusion, many moving away from the flames in the opposite direction from our escape route. Those further out began to approach the fire, drawn by the visual stimulus but maintaining enough distance to avoid being burned. "Don't look back," I urged as we ran. "Keep moving, pace yourselves." The diversionary fire had worked better than I dared hope, creating a window of opportunity to put significant distance between ourselves and the infected. We maintained a sustainable jogging pace across the desert terrain, heading toward a line of low hills that might offer concealment for the next phase of our journey. Only when we reached the shelter of the hills did I allow the group a brief rest, using the elevation to check our back trail. The pump house was now fully engulfed, sending a column of black smoke into the morning sky. Most of the infected had moved away from the fire, but disconcertingly, some were already beginning to resume their hunting pattern, spreading out in a search formation that would eventually cross our trail. "They adapt so quickly," Dr. Reyes observed, watching their movement, learning from each new stimulus, improving their response. The rate of adaptation suggests the infection might be creating new neural pathways, I theorized, documenting my observations in my journal. Not just destroying brain tissue, but rewiring it for new functions? This possibility was perhaps the most frightening yet. If the infection was actively restructuring human brains rather than simply damaging them, the long-term implications for containment and survival were dire. What other capabilities might emerge as the infected continued to evolve? We continued northeast, maintaining a steadier pace now that immediate danger had passed. The landscape gradually changed as we moved, desert giving way to scattered pine forests as elevation increased. The terrain offered better concealment but also created new dangers, limited visibility, and more places for infected to hide. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion began to take its toll. Trevor struggled to maintain pace again, his face flushed despite adequate hydration. Melissa developed a painful blister that slowed her progress. Even Danny, the most physically conditioned among us, showed signs of fatigue after nearly 2 days of constant stress and limited rest. "We need shelter before nightfall," I decided, recognizing that pushing further might result in injuries or mistakes that could prove fatal. Something defensible where we can actually rest. The ranger station remained our primary objective, but at our current pace, we wouldn't reach it before dark. We needed an intermediate location, somewhere to recover strength and formulate a plan for the final approach to our destination. Around 4 in the afternoon, we spotted a structure through the trees, a small cabin or hunting lodge set against a rocky hillside. I approached cautiously, surveying the location through binoculars before allowing the group to advance. "Appears abandoned," I reported after careful observation. "No signs of recent activity, human or infected." The cabin proved to be a seasonal hunting lodge, basic but secure with solid doors and shuttered windows. Most importantly, it was built against a rock face, eliminating one entire side as a potential point of entry. A quick search confirmed it was empty and undisturbed since the outbreak began. "We'll rest here tonight," I announced, already formulating security protocols. "Take watches in pairs, 2-hour rotations, maintain noise discipline, and keep shutters closed after dark." Inside, we found modest but valuable supplies: canned food, a mechanical water pump connected to a well, basic first aid materials. The discovery lifted everyone's spirits and restored some sense of normalcy as we prepared a proper meal for the first time since leaving Phoenix. As evening approached, I used the cabin's elevated position to scan our surroundings methodically. No infected were visible in the immediate vicinity, but the smoke from the pump house fire still rose in the distance, a concerning beacon that might draw attention, infected, human, or military, to the general area. Dr. Reyes treated Melissa's blister and checked everyone for signs of heat exhaustion or dehydration. Trevor's condition had improved with rest and proper hydration, but she remained concerned about his stamina for the journey ahead. The ranger station is about 5 miles from here, I told the group as we gathered around a map spread on the cabin's table. Based on its location and design, it should have radio equipment, possibly even satellite communication capability. If it hasn't been overrun or looted, Danny pointed out pragmatically. True, I acknowledged, but it's also a designated emergency management facility for the region, built to serve as a command post during wildfire season. That means reinforced construction, backup power, and potentially stockpiled supplies. More importantly, though I didn't say it aloud, the ranger station might have updated information about military movements and the status of Vermilion Cliffs. Our current plan was based on increasingly outdated intelligence as communications continued to deteriorate across the region. As night fell, we secured the cabin and established our watch rotation. During my shift, I updated my journal with detailed observations about infected behavior patterns and adaptation rates. The documentation process helped organize my thoughts and might prove valuable if we reached Vermilion Cliffs with its research facilities. The night passed without incident, a rare blessing after the constant threats of the previous 48 hours. Everyone managed at least 4 hours of unbroken sleep, restoring both physical and mental resources depleted by continuous crisis response. Dawn brought renewed determination and improved spirits. We ate a substantial breakfast from the cabin's supplies, refilled our water containers, and prepared to cover the final distance to the ranger station. If all went well, we would reach it by mid-morning, potentially establishing communication with other survivor groups or authorities. "Movement to the south," Danny reported from her watch position at the cabin's rear window. Multiple figures, moving with purpose. Through binoculars, I confirmed her sighting, at least 15 infected approaching from the direction of the pump house fire, now just smoldering ruins in the distance. They moved with that distinctive coordinated pattern, spread out in a rough search formation rather than clustered together. "They tracked us," Trevor said, the fear evident in his voice despite his attempt to control it. "All this way, through the terrain changes. They're following our scent trail," Dr. Reyes suggested, "like bloodhounds. The infection must be enhancing olfactory capabilities while suppressing higher functions." That theory aligned with their behavior, systematic tracking across varied terrain, maintaining course despite visual obstacles and distractions. If correct, it meant our diversionary tactics would become increasingly less effective as the infected refined their hunting methods. "We move now," I decided, "directly to the ranger station. If they've tracked us this far, they'll find the cabin regardless. Better to be gone when they arrive." We departed immediately, leaving the cabin secured behind us to slow the infected when they reached it. The terrain became increasingly forested as we moved northeast, providing better concealment but reducing our own visibility and awareness of threats. The miles passed under a growing sense of urgency, each of us acutely aware of the pursuing infected. We maintained a faster pace than prudent, knowing that fatigue later was preferable to being overtaken now. Occasional glances back confirmed our fears. The infected were indeed following our trail with unsettling precision. Around mid-morning, the trees thinned to reveal a clearing ahead. In the center stood our destination, the ranger station, a substantial 2-story structure with observation tower, surrounded by a chain-link perimeter fence. The sight brought momentary relief until we drew close enough to see that the gate hung open, the main door visibly damaged. "Someone's been here," Danny observed, stating the obvious but necessary caution. Or something, Trevor added grimly. We approached with extreme caution, moving from tree to tree at the forest edge to maintain cover while observing the station for any movement. After 10 minutes of careful surveillance with no signs of activity, I decided we needed to investigate more closely. Danny and I will approach the main building, I said. The rest of you stay here, maintain observation. If something goes wrong, head northeast toward the highway. There's a marked service road on the map that should provide the clearest path. No one liked the split group plan, but they understood the necessity of balance between caution and our urgent need for the station's resources. Danny and I advanced methodically, using available cover and moving in coordinated rushes between exposed areas. As we reached the perimeter fence, the damage became more apparent. Sections torn down, not cut or removed, but physically pulled apart with tremendous force. The main building showed similar destruction: door torn from hinges, windows broken, interior visible from outside. Something had attacked this location with significant violence, far beyond the capabilities of human looters. Infected? Danny whispered as we paused at the building's corner. Different, I replied, noting the distinctive destruction pattern. More powerful, more deliberate than what we've seen before. The implications were disturbing. If the infection was producing variants with enhanced physical capabilities, our understanding of the threat was even more incomplete than we had realized. We entered the building cautiously, weapons ready. The interior had been thoroughly ransacked, equipment destroyed, furniture overturned, supplies scattered. Most concerning was the presence of dried blood on walls and floors, suggesting violent confrontation rather than simple abandonment. The communications room had suffered the worst destruction. Radio equipment lay smashed beyond repair, computer systems destroyed systematically rather than in random violence. The pattern suggested purposeful neutralization of communication capability, not mindless rage. This wasn't standard infected behavior, I concluded, examining the specific nature of the damage. This was targeted destruction of communication infrastructure. By what? Danny asked, the unease evident in her voice. The infected we've encountered don't show this level of specific intent. Something else, I replied grimly. Something worse. We completed our survey quickly, gathering what usable supplies remained while maintaining vigilant watch for any return of whatever had caused the destruction. The ranger station's value as a safe haven or communication point was lost, but it still offered temporary shelter and a vantage point to observe the approaching infected tracking our group. Returning to the others, I reported our findings. The news visibly impacted morale. The ranger station had represented a crucial waypoint in our journey to Vermilion Cliffs, and its destruction removed both resources and psychological reassurance from our plan. So what now? Melissa asked, the question everyone was thinking. I consulted the map, recalculating routes and timelines. We continue northeast. The military checkpoint we've been trying to avoid is approximately 20 miles from here. If we maintain pace and avoid further delays, we could reach it by tomorrow afternoon. I thought we were avoiding military contact, Trevor reminded me. Plans change based on new information, I replied. Whatever destroyed the ranger station represents a threat potentially more dangerous than military quarantine procedures. Additionally, the infected pursuing us are demonstrating increasingly sophisticated tracking abilities. Our original strategy of evasion may no longer be viable. The decision to approach a military checkpoint carried significant risks. We had heard reports of soldiers firing on civilians at containment lines, treating all potential carriers as threats. But continuing through wilderness increasingly populated by both standard infected and whatever new threat had emerged seemed equally dangerous. We need to consider all possibilities, Dr. Reyes suggested, her medical training prompting systematic evaluation. including that Vermilion Cliffs might not be secure or might not accept civilians even with your credentials. And that possibility had haunted me since our journey began, but I had pushed it aside to maintain focus and direction. Now, with our situation deteriorating, contingency planning became essential. One problem at a time, I decided. First, we need to evade the infected tracking us. Then we reassess approach options for the military checkpoint based on observed protocols. We gathered our supplies and prepared to depart, the reality of our situation weighing heavily on each of us. Nearly 54 hours had passed since the infection first emerged in Phoenix. In that time, civilization had begun to collapse around us. The infected had evolved from mindless shamblers to coordinated hunters, and now some new threat had emerged with capabilities we didn't understand. Our journey to Vermilion Cliffs, originally challenging but straightforward, had become a navigation through escalating dangers with diminishing resources and options. And behind us, the infected continued their relentless pursuit, learning and adapting with each encounter. The next 24 hours would determine whether any of us survived to reach potential safety or became just another statistic in the rapidly unfolding apocalypse. August 17th marks exactly 48 days since everything collapsed. My name is Soren Blackthorn. I worked as a disaster relief logistics specialist and emergency communications expert for Sunbelt Relief Organization before all this happened. I'm recording this account from the Vermilion Cliffs Research Station in northern Arizona, where 17 of us have managed to secure a relatively safe position. This documentation isn't just for whoever might find it if we don't make it. It's also for those of you out there still fighting to survive. What I learned in those first critical hours might help keep you alive. Before I was a survivor, I coordinated emergency responses to natural disasters across North America. I specialized in establishing communication networks when infrastructure failed, after hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires. 20 years in disaster zones taught me how quickly civilization can unravel, but nothing prepared me for how fast everything fell apart 7 weeks ago. The morning it all started seemed completely ordinary. Phoenix was suffering through its third consecutive month of record-breaking heat. The drought had reached critical levels, and my team at Sunbelt Relief was coordinating water deliveries to remote communities where wells had run dry. Our office occupied 4 floors of a modern building downtown, filled with maps, communication equipment, and people dedicated to helping others. Dr. Eliza Reyes, our medical coordinator, had mentioned an uptick in fever cases at local hospitals that morning. "Probably heat-related," she said, but something in her voice suggested concern beyond standard heat stroke patients. Danny Ortiz, my communications deputy, had been monitoring emergency frequencies and noticed an increased volume of calls from the southeast part of the city. 30% more emergency calls than yesterday, she reported during our morning briefing, most from the neighborhoods around Banner Gateway Medical Center. I should have paid more attention to that detail. The hospital would later be identified as the first major outbreak point. Trevor from accounting complained about budget overruns for our drought relief program. It seems almost comical now how concerned we were about spreadsheets and funding when a few hours later money would become completely meaningless. The first real indication came at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon. I remember checking my watch because the call came through on an emergency frequency normally reserved for first responders. "Emergency. Please." The voice was female, professional, but clearly panicked. "They're attacking everyone at the hospital. Security can't contain them." Then static. I adjusted my headset, thinking it might be a domestic violence situation at one of the medical facilities. "This is Soren Blackthorn with Sunbelt Relief. Please identify your location and nature of emergency." No response. But within minutes, similar calls flooded every emergency channel. Attacks, biting, people turning violent. The reports came from scattered locations across Phoenix at first, then from Tucson, then Las Vegas. The pattern made no sense. Multiple incidents occurring simultaneously across the Southwest. Standard protocol is failing, I told my team, already feeling that professional calm settling over me. The same detachment that got me through earthquakes in Haiti and tsunamis in Thailand. Switch to Crisis Response Level 2. That's when Danny burst through my office door. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. "Soren, you need to see this." She turned on the wall-mounted television in my office. Every news channel showed the same footage. Chaos in the streets. People attacking one another with an animalistic fervor. The victims would fall. Then, minutes later, rise again and join the attackers. The anchors were using phrases like mass psychosis and extreme violence, but their voices held that edge of barely controlled terror I recognized from the worst disaster zones I'd worked. "What are we seeing?" I asked Dr. Reyes, who had joined us. "It looks like some kind of neurological pathogen," she said, her medical training asserting itself despite her obvious shock. "The aggression, the biting behavior, the apparent spread through fluid contact." "You're saying it's spreading through bites," Danny whispered, staring at the screens, "like those old zombie movies." I didn't have time to process how ridiculous that sounded before our building's alarm system began wailing. Through the office windows, I watched as a delivery truck crashed into the parking lot barricade. The driver stumbled out, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. Blood covered his shirt, and when he turned toward our building, I could see even from 4 floors up that something was terribly wrong with his eyes. Vacant, yet somehow focused in a way that wasn't human. "Lock down the building," I ordered, already reaching for my emergency pack, always prepared from years in disaster zones. "Danny, use the PA system. Tell everyone to gather on this floor. Trevor, contact building security." "Lines are down," Trevor said, his face ashen as he repeatedly pressed buttons on his desk phone. "Cell network, too. Just getting busy signals." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a localized incident. Communication systems getting overloaded is always the first sign of a major catastrophe. I'd seen it in every disaster zone I'd worked in. When everyone tries to call for help at once, no one gets through. "Use the emergency satellite phone," I told Danny, handing her the device from my pack. "Try to reach the State Emergency Management Office. We need to understand what we're dealing with." The next 30 minutes were a blur of activity. More staff arrived on our floor, some in panic, others in shock. Through the windows, the streets of Phoenix transformed before our eyes. Cars crashed, people ran, others moved with that same distinctive shambling gait as the delivery driver, chasing down anyone trying to flee. "Satellite connection failed," Danny reported, getting a network unavailable message. That's when true fear first gripped me. In 20 years of disaster response, I'd never seen satellite communications completely fail. Whatever was happening was beyond anything in our contingency planning. Dr. Reyes took charge of treating a security guard who'd been bitten while trying to secure the lobby. The wound on his arm looked minor, but he developed a fever almost immediately. "His temperature is 104 and rising," she said, her voice clinically detached but her eyes showing deep concern. "Heart rate elevated. Pupils dilated. This isn't normal for any infection I'm familiar with." I made the call that would shape everything that followed. "We need to isolate him. Now." The guard protested weakly, but within 20 minutes he lost consciousness. Within 45 minutes he stopped breathing. And 10 minutes after that, just as I was documenting time of death in my emergency log, he opened his eyes again. But it wasn't him anymore. Whatever made that security guard a person was gone, replaced by something primal and hungry. He lunged at Dr. Reyes, teeth bared. Trevor reacted first, shoving a desk between Dr. Reyes and the guard. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back as the guard, or what used to be the guard, slammed into the furniture. His movements were uncoordinated but powerful, driven by something beyond normal human capability. "Conference room," I ordered, maintaining the calm voice I'd developed through years of crisis management. "Everyone move now. Barricade the door." 7 of us made it inside: myself, Dr. Reyes, Danny, Trevor, and 3 others from the drought response team. The thick conference room door held as we pushed the heavy table against it. Through the small window, I watched as the infected guard lurched around the office, attacking anything that moved. 2 other staff members who hadn't made it to the conference room in time became victims, and I forced myself to document their names in my notebook. "This is actually happening," Danny whispered, her voice trembling but her hands steady as she tried the landline phone again. "This isn't possible." "It's happening," I confirmed, switching on the emergency radio I always carried. "And based on what we're seeing on the news, it's happening everywhere." The television in the conference room still worked, cycling through news channels that showed identical scenes of chaos across the Southwest. The anchors maintained a veneer of professionalism, but their information was spotty at best. Reports of violent individuals attacking others, recommendations to stay indoors, claims that authorities were responding to the situation. "They're downplaying it," Dr. Reyes said, watching the screen with clinical detachment. "Classic crisis management. Control information to prevent panic." "But they don't understand what they're dealing with," I replied, tuning the radio to emergency frequencies. "Listen." Through the static came fragments of first responder communications. Police officers reporting being overrun. Fire stations unable to respond to calls. Hospitals declaring internal disasters as patients attacked staff. The system was collapsing in real time. "I'm hearing the same patterns from Las Vegas, Tucson, Albuquerque," I told the group, writing information in my disaster journal. "This isn't isolated to Phoenix. It's regional, at minimum." Dr. Reyes examined the security guard's blood sample she'd taken before he turned. With our limited resources, she couldn't do much, but her medical training provided crucial insights. "The infection rate is unlike anything I've seen," she reported. "Whatever this is affects the brainstem first, the primitive parts that control basic functions. It leaves those intact while shutting down higher brain functions. That's why they can still walk, still bite, still hunt, but show no sign of consciousness or reason." "How does it spread?" Trevor asked, his accounting background making him think in terms of vectors and rates. "Fluid transmission through bites is the primary vector," she answered. "But given how rapidly this is spreading, I suspect there may be a secondary transmission method, possibly airborne for the initial infection, with the bites accelerating the process." That information changed my entire assessment of our situation. If the pathogen had an airborne component, nowhere in the building would be safe long-term. "We need to move," I decided, pulling out the emergency maps I kept in my pack. "This building isn't secure enough. Too many access points, too many people already inside who could be infected." "Move where?" Danny asked. "The whole city is falling apart." I spread the map of Arizona on the table. "North, away from population centers. The infection rate will be proportional to population density." Through the window, I could see more infected staff members joining the first guard, wandering through our office space with that distinctive shambling gait. Their movements seemed random until they detected motion or sound, then became terrifyingly focused. The building's emergency lights flickered, a bad sign. The backup generators should have kicked in automatically, but something was interfering with the system. If we lost power completely, the electronic door locks would fail. "We need to gather supplies first," I said, mentally cataloging what we'd need. Water, food, first aid supplies, weapons if possible. Weapons? Trevor looked shocked. "We're a relief organization. We don't have weapons." "Improvise," I told him firmly. "Fire extinguishers, scissors, anything that can be used defensively." The next hour was spent monitoring both the news and emergency channels while strategizing our escape. The power flickered repeatedly, each time causing a moment of pure terror as we feared the door locks would release. Through the radio, I picked up scattered military communications. The National Guard was being deployed, but their response was chaotic and uncoordinated. I tried repeatedly to establish contact with emergency management authorities, but communications were deteriorating rapidly. Cell networks were completely overwhelmed. Internet connectivity became sporadic, then non-existent. Even the emergency bands were going silent one by one as first responder stations fell. "The infection is spreading exponentially," Dr. Reyes said, watching the news footage. "The incubation period appears to be minutes, not hours or days. That's why containment is failing so quickly." A particularly violent slam against our conference room door made everyone jump. The infected were becoming more aggressive, more coordinated in their attacks. They seemed drawn to our voices, our movement, any sign of living prey. "We can't stay here much longer," I said, checking the time. Just 3 hours had passed since the first emergency call, but the world outside our windows was unrecognizable. Smoke rose from multiple locations across Phoenix. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles and bodies, some still, others rising to join the shambling masses. The building's alarm system suddenly blared again, a different pattern this time. 3 long tones followed by a short one. "Fire alarm," Danny translated, her face paling. "There's a fire somewhere in the building." That changed everything. Fire was a greater immediate threat than the infected. Smoke inhalation would kill us long before the infected could break through our barricade. "We move now," I decided. "The emergency stairwell leads to the parking garage. We take 2 vehicles. The drought response SUVs have full tanks and emergency equipment." I assigned roles quickly, drawing on my disaster management training. Danny would lead with the building's key card. Dr. Reyes would bring medical supplies. Trevor and I would provide rear security with improvised weapons, a fire axe for me, an extinguisher for him. "Stay together, move quickly, don't look back," I instructed. "If someone gets bitten, we have to leave them." "Understood?" The grim nods around the room showed that everyone comprehended the stakes. This wasn't a normal disaster where rescue was coming. We were entirely on our own. As smoke began to seep under the door, I made a final check of my emergency pack and secured my disaster journal, already containing crucial observations about the infection and our response. That journal would later become invaluable for other survivors. "Remember your training," I told the group, though none of them except Dr. Reyes had experience with crisis situations. "Breathe, focus, move with purpose." I gripped the fire axe tightly as Trevor and Danny moved the conference table away from the door. Through the small window, I could see at least 5 infected staff members lurching around the office, plus the thickening smoke that signaled our time was running out. "On my count," I said, hand on the door handle. 3, 2, 1. We burst through the door into chaos. The infected immediately turned toward the sound, their movements suddenly becoming focused and predatory. Trevor discharged the fire extinguisher, creating a cloud that momentarily confused them. I swung the axe not to kill, but to create space, keeping the creatures at bay as our group moved toward the emergency stairs. "Stay tight. Move fast," I called out as we navigated through the smoke-filled office. The emergency lights cast everything in a sickly red glow, transforming our familiar workplace into something out of a nightmare. What used to be our colleagues lurched between desks, their faces vacant except for a horrible focus whenever they detected our movement. Danny reached the stairwell door first, swiping her keycard. The electronic lock flashed green, and we piled through. I took a final count. All 7 of us had made it. I secured the heavy fire door behind us, knowing it wouldn't hold for long but might buy precious minutes. Down to the garage level, I instructed, taking point as we descended the stairs. Stay alert. We don't know what's waiting below. The stairwell was mercifully empty, but the sound of our footsteps echoed loudly in the concrete chamber. Every floor we passed, I paused to listen for movement beyond the doors. The smoke was less dense here, but the air felt thick with something else, a heaviness that went beyond physical sensation. Fear had its own presence, its own weight. "What about other survivors?" Melissa from Water Resource Management asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There must be others in the building." "We can't help them now," I replied, the words bitter but necessary. "Our priority is to get to vehicles and establish a secure location." Reaching the garage level, I signaled everyone to stop and pressed my ear against the door. The sounds beyond were faint but unmistakable: shuffling feet, occasional thuds, the low, inhuman moaning that seemed to be characteristic of the infected. "There are infected in the garage," I told the group. "We'll need to move quickly to the vehicles. They're in the southwest corner, emergency response section." I distributed car keys to Danny and myself. 2 vehicles, 3 people in one, 4 in the other. Dr. Reyes, Trevor, Melissa, with me. "Danny, you take the others. If we get separated, head north on Route 17. First rendezvous point is Sunset Point Rest Area." Drawing deep breaths, we prepared ourselves. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, but also determination. Humans are remarkably adaptable, even in the face of the impossible. In my years responding to disasters, I'd seen ordinary people find extraordinary courage when survival demanded it. "Remember, they're attracted to sound and movement," I said. "Move steadily, but don't run unless absolutely necessary." With a final nod, I pushed open the door. The garage was dimly lit by emergency lights, creating deep shadows between parked vehicles. I counted at least 7 infected wandering aimlessly. Former employees, security guards, perhaps visitors caught when the outbreak hit. They hadn't detected us yet. We moved as one unit, keeping low and using parked cars as cover. Halfway to our vehicles, an infected security guard turned suddenly, his milky eyes fixing on our movement. He let out a horrible wailing sound that alerted the others. "Run," I commanded, abandoning stealth for speed. The next moments were pure adrenaline-fueled chaos. The infected moved with surprising speed when pursuing prey, closing the distance alarmingly quickly. I used the axe to keep them at bay, creating a path for the others. Danny reached her vehicle first, quickly ushering her group inside. I continued to hold the line, allowing Dr. Reyes, Trevor, and Melissa to reach our SUV. "Soren, come on," Dr. Reyes called, the engine already running. I backed toward the vehicle, swinging the axe in wide arcs to maintain distance from the approaching infected. One lunged suddenly from my peripheral vision. Janet, from HR, her face twisted in hunger, business suit torn and bloody. I sidestepped and pushed her away with the axe handle, refusing to strike a killing blow against someone who had been a colleague hours earlier. That hesitation nearly cost me everything. She grabbed the axe handle, pulling me off balance. Another infected, I couldn't even recognize who it had been, approached from behind. Trevor appeared suddenly beside me, the fire extinguisher swinging in a wide arc that connected with Janet's head. It didn't kill her. We would later learn that only severe brain trauma stopped them permanently, but it knocked her back long enough for me to break free. We scrambled into the SUV as infected hands slapped against the windows. Dr. Reyes was already in the driver's seat, revving the engine. Danny's vehicle had reached the garage exit, waiting for us despite the danger. "Go, go, go," I urged as doctor. Reyes floored the accelerator, weaving through abandoned cars toward the exit. The garage gate was down, locked in place when the power became unstable. Danny's vehicle rammed it once, twice, the reinforced front bumper of the emergency response vehicle finally breaking through the barrier on the third attempt. We emerged into blinding, late-afternoon sunlight and a scene straight from apocalyptic fiction. Downtown Phoenix, normally bustling with activity, had transformed into a war zone in just a few hours. Abandoned vehicles clogged intersections. Small fires burned unchecked in storefronts. And everywhere, the infected roamed in growing numbers. "Take Central Avenue North," I instructed Dr. Reyes. "It's wider, might have fewer blockages." Through the radio, I contacted Danny in the lead vehicle. "Stay close, maintain speed around 25 miles per hour. Fast enough to outpace them, slow enough to navigate obstacles." As we drove through the dying city, I documented everything in my journal. The infection patterns, the behavior of the infected, the rate of spread. These observations would later prove crucial for establishing survival protocols at Vermilion Cliffs. Traffic thinned as we reached the northern suburbs, but the situation wasn't much better. The infected seemed to be everywhere, their numbers increasing exponentially. Particularly disturbing were the freshly turned, people who still wore expressions of shock or confusion as their bodies moved with that distinctive shambling gait. "The transition must leave some residual awareness initially," Dr. Reyes observed clinically, though I could hear the horror beneath her professional tone. "The newer ones still show facial expressions, remnants of who they were." "Does that mean they could be cured?" Melissa asked, hope evident in her voice. Dr. Reyes didn't answer immediately. When she did, her words were carefully measured. "We don't have enough information yet. But the neurological damage I observed in the security guard was extensive. If this infection destroys brain tissue rather than just affecting function, recovery might be impossible." That grim assessment hung in the air as we navigated through Paradise Valley, following Danny's vehicle. The affluent neighborhood showed the same patterns of destruction and abandonment as downtown, though with fewer infected visible on the streets. "The news said shelter in place," Trevor noted, looking at the massive homes we passed. "People here had the resources to secure themselves inside." "For now," I replied. "But without infrastructure, without supply chains, without communications, no location remains secure indefinitely." That was a lesson I'd learned repeatedly in disaster zones. Initial survival often depended on immediate resources and luck, but long-term survival required adaptation and community. Individuals rarely survived catastrophic events alone, regardless of their initial advantages. As we approached the northern edge of the metro area, the landscape opened up. The Sonoran Desert stretched before us, harsh and beautiful, and seemingly empty. But I knew better than to assume safety. The infection had spread too quickly, too widely for any area to be truly secure. "We need a defensible location with sustainable resources," I told the group, thinking ahead to our next moves. The Vermilion Cliffs Research Station might be our best option. Remote location, solar-powered limited access points, and they have a satellite communications array. What I didn't tell them was how unlikely it was we'd make it there. Phoenix held over 4 million people. I used the axe to keep them at bay, creating a path for the others. Danny reached her vehicle first, quickly ushering her group inside. I continued to hold the line, allowing Dr. Reyes, Trevor, and Melissa to reach our SUV. "Soren, come on," Dr. Reyes called, the engine already running. I backed toward the vehicle, swinging the axe in wide arcs to maintain distance from the approaching infected. One lunged suddenly from my peripheral vision. Janet, from HR, her face twisted in hunger, business suit torn and bloody. I sidestepped and pushed her away with the axe handle, refusing to strike a killing blow against someone who had been a colleague hours earlier. That hesitation nearly cost me everything. She grabbed the axe handle, pulling me off balance. Another infected, I couldn't even recognize who it had been, approached from behind. Trevor appeared suddenly beside me, the fire extinguisher swinging in a wide arc that connected with Janet's head. It didn't kill her. We would later learn that only severe brain trauma stopped them permanently, but it knocked her back long enough for me to break free. We scrambled into the SUV as infected hands slapped against the windows. Dr. Reyes was already in the driver's seat, revving the engine. Danny's vehicle had reached the garage exit, waiting for us despite the danger. "Go, go, go," I urged as doctor. Reyes floored the accelerator, weaving through abandoned cars toward the exit. The garage gate was down, locked in place when the power became unstable. Danny's vehicle rammed it once, twice, the reinforced front bumper of the emergency response vehicle finally breaking through the barrier on the third attempt. We emerged into blinding, late-afternoon sunlight and a scene straight from apocalyptic fiction. Downtown Phoenix, normally bustling with activity, had transformed into a war zone in just a few hours. Abandoned vehicles clogged intersections. Small fires burned unchecked in storefronts. And everywhere, the infected roamed in growing numbers. "Take Central Avenue North," I instructed Dr. Reyes. "It's wider, might have fewer blockages." Through the radio, I contacted Danny in the lead vehicle. "Stay close, maintain speed around 25 miles per hour. Fast enough to outpace them, slow enough to navigate obstacles." As we drove through the dying city, I documented everything in my journal. The infection patterns, the behavior of the infected, the rate of spread. These observations would later prove crucial for establishing survival protocols at Vermilion Cliffs. Traffic thinned as we reached the northern suburbs, but the situation wasn't much better. The infected seemed to be everywhere, their numbers increasing exponentially. Particularly disturbing were the freshly turned, people who still wore expressions of shock or confusion as their bodies moved with that distinctive shambling gait. The transition must leave some residual awareness initially, Dr. Reyes observed clinically, though I could hear the horror beneath her professional tone. The newer ones still show facial expressions, remnants of who they were. "Does that mean they could be cured?" Melissa asked, hope evident in her voice. Dr. Reyes didn't answer immediately. When she did, her words were carefully measured. "We don't have enough information yet. But the neurological damage I observed in the security guard was extensive. If this infection destroys brain tissue rather than just affecting function, recovery might be impossible." That grim assessment hung in the air as we navigated through Paradise Valley, following Danny's vehicle. The affluent neighborhood showed the same patterns of destruction and abandonment as downtown, though with fewer infected visible on the streets. "The news said shelter in place," Trevor noted, looking at the massive homes we passed. "People here had the resources to secure themselves inside." "For now," I replied. "But without infrastructure, without supply chains, without communications, no location remains secure indefinitely." That was a lesson I'd learned repeatedly in disaster zones. Initial survival often depended on immediate resources and luck, but long-term survival required adaptation and community. Individuals rarely survived catastrophic events alone, regardless of their initial advantages. As we approached the northern edge of the metro area, the landscape opened up. The Sonoran Desert stretched before us, harsh and beautiful, and seemingly empty. But I knew better than to assume safety. The infection had spread too quickly, too widely for any area to be truly secure. We need a defensible location with sustainable resources, I told the group, thinking ahead to our next moves. The Vermilion Cliffs Research Station might be our best option. Remote location, solar-powered limited access points, and they have a satellite communications array. What I didn't tell them was how unlikely it was we'd make it there. Phoenix held over 4 million people. If even a fraction were infected, the roads north would become increasingly dangerous. And we still had no idea how far the infection had spread beyond Arizona. I checked my watch as we passed the final suburbs of Phoenix, merging onto Interstate 17 northbound. Just 6 hours had elapsed since that first emergency call. 6 hours in which civilization had begun to collapse around us. 6 hours that had transformed me from a disaster response coordinator to a survivor fighting for my life. And I knew with grim certainty that the worst was yet to come. Interstate 17 should have been our fastest route north, but reality quickly destroyed that plan. The highway had become a graveyard of abandoned vehicles. People had clearly tried to flee the city en masse as the situation deteriorated, creating massive traffic jams that eventually became death traps when the infection spread among the trapped motorists. "We need to find an alternate route," I said, studying the map as Dr. Reyes slowly maneuvered around the obstacle course of empty cars. "There's a frontage road that parallels the highway about half a mile east. It won't be as direct, but might be clearer." I radioed the information to Danny's vehicle ahead of us. They acknowledged and took the next exit, our SUV following close behind. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. The beautiful Arizona sunset felt like a cruel contrast to the horror unfolding beneath it. "What happens after dark?" Trevor asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. "Do they behave differently?" "Unknown," I replied honestly. "But we should assume night creates additional risks. Limited visibility for us, while they don't seem to rely primarily on sight for hunting." As if to underscore my point, we rounded a bend to find Danny's vehicle stopped. Through the windshield, I could see why. A group of about 15 infected had gathered around a crashed pickup truck. They were tearing at something inside the cab, and I forced myself not to think too hard about what, or who, it might be. "Back up," I instructed Dr. Reyes quietly. "Find another route." She reversed carefully, the headlights illuminating more infected emerging from the desert scrub drawn by our engines. The realization hit me then. They were everywhere. The infection hadn't just spread through the city, it had escaped containment completely. We doubled back and found a narrow access road leading northwest. It wasn't ideal, taking us slightly off our planned route, but it was clear of both vehicles and infected. The rough terrain slowed our progress, but at least we were moving. "The radio hasn't had any new emergency broadcasts in over an hour," Trevor noted, checking the frequencies I'd set up. "That's not a good sign," I replied. "It means the emergency response infrastructure is collapsing." As the last light faded from the sky, we were forced to use headlights, making our vehicles visible for miles across the flat desert landscape. Every set of headlights or taillights we saw in the distance became a potential threat. Were they other survivors, or infected drawn to the light? We maintained radio contact with Danny's vehicle, using short transmissions to minimize the chance of other survivors detecting our frequency. Trust had become a luxury none of us could afford. Other survivors might be just as dangerous as the infected, competing for the same limited resources. Around 9 in the evening, we spotted a small gas station illuminated by emergency generator power. It stood isolated along a secondary road, seemingly untouched by the chaos. After careful observation from a distance, we decided to approach. We needed fuel and potentially supplies. "I'll go first," I volunteered, taking the fire axe. Doctor, Reyes, keep the engine running. If anything happens, don't wait for me. The gas station appeared deserted, but the lights and functioning pumps suggested someone had been there recently. I approached cautiously, scanning for movement. The glass doors of the convenience store were intact, the interior dimly lit by emergency lighting. I rapped on the glass with the handle of the axe, then waited. If infected were inside, the sound would draw them. After a full minute with no response, I tried the door. It was unlocked. "Hello," I called, entering cautiously. "Anyone here?" The silence was broken by a shuffling sound from behind the counter. I raised the axe defensively as a figure emerged, an older man in his 60s, clutching a shotgun. "You bit?" he demanded, keeping the weapon trained on me. "No," I replied steadily. 7 of us total. All clean. We're headed north." He studied me for a long moment, then lowered the shotgun slightly. "Name's Ray. Station's mine. Power's out, but the generator keeps the pumps running. We need fuel," I said, "and any supplies you can spare. We can trade information." Ray barked a harsh laugh. "Information?" The vehicle that had been following us stopped about half a mile away. Headlights still off, but engine occasionally audible in the desert stillness. "They're waiting for us to sleep," I told Dr. Reyes as we shared watch duty. "Or for us to move on so they can follow." "What do we do?" she asked, the exhaustion evident in her voice despite her best efforts to hide it. "We changed their calculation," I replied, reaching for the emergency flare gun in my pack. "Make them think we're not worth the trouble." I fired a flare high into the air, illuminating the desert in harsh red light. The signal was visible for miles and would attract any infected in the area. A calculated risk, but one that sent a clear message to our pursuers. We were aware and prepared to draw attention rather than become victims. The strategy worked. Within minutes, the distant vehicle's engine started, and it retreated back toward the gas station. Either they weren't willing to risk confronting an alert group, or they didn't want to deal with any infected the flare might attract. Either way, it bought us precious hours. We established a rotation of 2-hour watch shifts, allowing everyone to get at least some rest. I took the first and last watches, using the time to update my journal with everything we'd learned and observed. The infection spread pattern, the behavior of the infected, the military response, Ray's claim about government involvement. All information that might prove vital later. Before dawn, I woke the group. Everyone looked haggard, the previous day's events leaving physical and emotional marks, but there was also a new resolute quality to their expressions. The initial shock and disbelief had hardened into determination. "We need to modify our route," I announced, spreading the map across the hood of the SUV. "Based on what Ray said about military blockades, Interstate 17 will likely be impassable near Flagstaff. We'll take secondary roads through Sedona, then cut northeast toward the Navajo Nation. Longer route, but potentially fewer bottlenecks." "What about fuel?" Trevor asked, always the pragmatic accountant. "The SUVs have auxiliary tanks," I assured him. "We've got enough to reach Vermilion Cliffs if we're careful. Food and water are bigger concerns." We organized our supplies, consolidating everything into the more fuel-efficient vehicle to create a reserve option if one SUV became disabled. Just as the first light appeared on the eastern horizon, we moved out, maintaining radio contact between vehicles and keeping a careful watch for movement. The secondary roads were mostly clear, though we occasionally encountered abandoned vehicles or wandering infected. The creatures seemed more sluggish in the early morning hours, as if the night's cold had slowed their metabolism. We were able to navigate around them without direct confrontation, preserving our limited ammunition and energy. Around mid-morning, we approached a small town called Mayer. Under normal circumstances, we would have bypassed it entirely, but our fuel gauges were dropping faster than anticipated due to the rough terrain. We needed to replenish our supplies. "I'll scout ahead," I volunteered, taking the binoculars from my pack. From a hillside overlooking the town, I surveyed the situation. Mayor appeared largely abandoned, with only occasional movement visible, the now familiar shambling gait of the infected. A gas station on the edge of town showed no signs of activity. "Looks like our best option," I reported back to the group, "but we go in prepared. Quick stop, minimum noise, everyone stays alert." We approached cautiously, stopping 100 yards from the station to listen and observe. The stillness was unnerving. No birds, no distant traffic sounds, none of the background noise of civilization that we normally tune out. Just profound silence, broken only by the desert wind. I signaled Dr. Reyes to position our vehicle for a quick exit while Danny did the same with the second SUV. Trevor and I approached the gas station on foot, weapons ready. The power was out, which meant the pumps wouldn't work, but I carried siphoning equipment in my emergency kit. "Check inside while I work on the fuel," I instructed Trevor, handing him the fire axe. "Any sign of movement, you get out immediately." He nodded grimly, the former accountant now moving with the cautious precision of someone who had learned survival skills overnight. In just 24 hours, all of us had been transformed by necessity. I began siphoning fuel from the underground tanks, a laborious process but essential for our continued journey. Every few seconds I scanned our surroundings, hyper-aware of any movement or sound. The desert heat was already building, waves of it rising from the asphalt. Trevor emerged from the station with a small haul of bottled water and energy bars. "Place is mostly cleaned out," he reported, "but I found these behind the counter." I nodded, continuing the siphoning process. "Every bit helps. We should be ready to move in about 10 minutes. That's when I noticed it. Movement at the edge of town. Not the random shambling of the infected, but the deliberate advance of a group of people. Through the binoculars, I counted 6 individuals, all armed, moving with tactical precision toward our position. "We've got company," I alerted the group through the radio. "Armed humans approaching from the west. Not military based on their movement pattern. Everyone back to vehicles now." I quickened the fuel transfer, acutely aware of how exposed we were. The approaching group had clearly spotted us and was now moving with more purpose. I couldn't tell if their intentions were hostile, but recent experience had made me wary of other survivors. "Dr. Reyes, start the engine but hold position," I instructed over the radio. "Danny, be ready to provide covering fire if needed." I finished the fuel transfer and secured the equipment in record time. Trevor and I were halfway back to the vehicles when a voice called out, "That's far enough. Hands where we can see them." We froze. The group had closed the distance faster than I anticipated, now positioned between us and our vehicles. Their weapons, a mix of hunting rifles and shotguns, were pointed directly at us. "We're just passing through," I called back, keeping my voice calm and even. "No need for conflict." The apparent leader of the group, a weathered man in his 40s, stepped forward. "Those are nice vehicles you've got. Lot of supplies too, I'd bet." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. I could see Dr. Reyes and Danny in the vehicles, tension evident even at this distance. If shooting started, we'd likely all die, either from bullets or from the infected that gunfire would attract. I decided to try a different approach, drawing on my disaster zone negotiation experience. I'm Soren Blackthorne, disaster relief specialist. My group has valuable information about safe routes north and the infection spread patterns. Information worth more than our vehicles or supplies. The leader hesitated, clearly not expecting this response. "What kind of information?" "Military blockades at specific locations. Infection, hot zones to avoid. Radio frequencies still operational. Methods to distinguish early-stage infected before they turn." Some of this was exaggeration, but I needed to change the dynamic. A woman in the group whispered something to the leader, who lowered his weapon slightly. "Prove it. Tell us something useful." I thought quickly. The infected are temperature sensitive. They're most active during moderate temperatures, sluggish in extreme cold or heat. That's why they're less aggressive in early morning and peak afternoon. Plan your movements accordingly. This was an observation I'd documented but hadn't fully verified. However, it seemed to ring true to them based on their own experiences. The leader nodded slowly. "What else you know about them?" "They hunt primarily by sound, secondarily by movement. Their vision seems impaired, especially in bright light. They can't reason or use tools, but they remember basic functions from before turning. That's why some try to open doors or turn handles." The standoff tension decreased slightly as both groups recognized the potential value in cooperation. The leader introduced himself as Mike, former sheriff's deputy from Prescott. His group had been on the move since the previous morning when their town fell to the infected. "We've got a temporary camp in the hills," Mike offered after further discussion. "Defensible position, water source. You're welcome to rest there while we exchange information." I glanced at Dr. Reyes, who gave a slight nod. We were all exhausted, and an alliance, even temporary, offered benefits to both groups. "We accept," I replied, "but we maintain control of our vehicles and supplies." The tension never fully dissipated as we followed Mike's group to their hillside position, a former fire lookout station with excellent visibility. But as we exchanged information and experiences, a fragile trust began to form. They had local knowledge we lacked, while we had broader information about the regional situation. Most importantly, they confirmed what Ray had claimed about military blockades to the north. The infection had reached Flagstaff, and the military was establishing a quarantine line along Interstate 40. No one was being allowed through, infected or not. That information forced me to reconsider our entire plan. If we couldn't reach Vermilion Cliffs from the south, we would need an entirely new destination or a way around the blockades. The 48 hours that had begun with an emergency call were becoming increasingly complex as the world around us continued to unravel. We left the devastated ranger station behind, pushing northeast through increasingly rugged terrain. The forested landscape provided better concealment but slowed our progress significantly. Every hour, I used high ground to check our back trail, confirming that the infected were still tracking us with that disturbing precision. They maintained a consistent distance, close enough to follow our scent but far enough to suggest they were no longer mindlessly rushing toward prey. This measured pursuit was yet another evolution in their hunting strategy. Around mid-afternoon, we encountered our first sign of the military presence in the region. A crashed helicopter in a small clearing, its tail section marked with standard Army identification. The aircraft showed no fire damage, suggesting mechanical failure rather than being shot down. More concerning was the absence of bodies or equipment. Someone or something had removed both from the crash site. "Recent," Dr. Reyes observed, examining the minimal plant growth through the disturbed soil. "Within the last 36 hours. "Military recovery team?" Trevor suggested hopefully. "Possibly," I replied, though something about the scene felt wrong. The methodical removal of all useful items made sense, but the complete absence of any human remains suggested something else, something that aligned with the destruction pattern at the ranger station. We salvaged what little remained, some emergency rations from a storage compartment the recovery team had missed, a partial military map with marked quarantine zones, and, most valuably, a functional emergency radio from a compartment that had sprung open during impact. The radio was set to military frequencies, allowing us to monitor communications without transmitting our own position. Most channels carried only static, but occasionally fragmented transmissions broke through, enough to piece together a disturbing picture of the regional situation. Perimeter breach at Checkpoint Foxtrot. Multiple Type 2s, requesting immediate air support. Negative on reinforcement. Fall back to secondary containment line. Repeat, all units withdraw to secondary line. Be advised, Type 3s confirmed at Winslow, implementing Firestorm Protocol Delta. The military terminology was unfamiliar, but the context suggested a classification system for infected, with Type 2s and Type 3s representing threats beyond the standard infected we had encountered initially. This aligned with our observation of evolving behaviors and potentially explained the destruction at the ranger station. Most concerning was the reference to a secondary containment line. If the military was abandoning their forward checkpoints, our plan to reach their perimeter might lead us into even greater danger, areas completely overrun by infected that even armed military units couldn't hold. The map from the helicopter provided crucial, updated information. The primary containment line had indeed been pushed back significantly from its original position, now running roughly along Interstate 40, still between us and Vermilion Cliffs. More disturbing were the marked red zones, areas completely abandoned to infection with warnings against any entry, even by military units. We were currently in one such red zone. This changes everything, I acknowledged, recalculating our options. The military checkpoint we were heading toward has been abandoned. The entire area between us and Interstate 40 is designated as compromised. So, we're trapped behind enemy lines, Danny translated, her background in emergency communications giving her a framework for understanding military protocols. Essentially, I confirmed. But the map shows potential extraction points, designated locations where civilians might still be evacuated if they can reach them. The nearest such point was marked at a regional airport about 15 miles northeast of our position. According to the map notations, limited air operations were still being conducted to retrieve essential personnel or civilians with special clearance. My disaster relief credentials might qualify, I explained to the group. If we can reach the extraction point, there's a chance we could be airlifted beyond the containment line. It was a desperate plan with minimal probability of success, but it offered direction and purpose when both were sorely needed. The alternative, continuing to wander through red zone territory with infected pursuing us, promised only eventual failure. We adjusted course toward the extraction point, pushing harder despite growing fatigue. The terrain gradually transitioned from forest to rolling grassland, offering faster travel but less concealment. With each passing mile, evidence of the infection's impact became more apparent. Abandoned vehicles, occasional structures showing signs of violent struggle, and most disturbing, the complete absence of wildlife or birds. As evening approached, we sought shelter in an isolated farmhouse. The building showed no signs of current occupation, human or infected, though the disarray inside told of hasty evacuation. We secured the perimeter and established watch rotations, using the remaining daylight to study the military map in greater detail. The notations suggest scheduled extraction operations at dawn and dusk, I explained, interpreting the military shorthand. If we reach the airport by tomorrow evening, we might have a chance at transport beyond the containment line. And if extraction isn't available, Dr. Reyes asked, always the pragmatist. The airport should have communication equipment, possibly even aircraft we could potentially use, I replied, though the latter was primarily to maintain morale. None of us had pilot training, but the possibility of finding functional long-range communications offered genuine hope. During my watch rotation that night, I monitored the military radio frequencies, documenting what fragments of communication came through. The transmissions painted an increasingly grim picture: containment failures at multiple locations, references to evolved variants, and repeated implementation of firestorm protocols that seemed to involve abandoning areas to infection rather than attempting to clear them. Most disturbing was a brief transmission near midnight, partially obscured by static but clearly referring to Vermilion Cliffs. Vermilion Research Facility requesting immediate extraction. Multiple Type 3s breaching outer perimeter. Authentication code Sierra Echo Victor Echo November. There was no audible response to the transmission, leaving the fate of our destination unknown. Had the research station fallen to the infection? Was extraction provided? The uncertainty added new urgency to our journey. If Vermilion Cliffs was no longer viable, we needed the information and potential evacuation options the airport might provide. Dawn brought clear skies and another sobering discovery. The infected pursuing us had closed the distance overnight, now visible on the horizon behind us. Their pace had increased, suggesting either improved physical capabilities or greater motivation driven by whatever intelligence governed their hunting behavior. "They're learning our patterns," Dr. Reyes observed as we hastily prepared to depart, "adapting to our rest cycles and increasing speed when we're stationary." This accelerating evolution of capabilities made our timeline even more critical. We needed to reach the extraction point before the infected either caught us or developed the strategies we couldn't counter. We traveled through the morning at an unsustainable pace, pushing physical limits to maintain distance from our pursuers. The landscape opened further as we approached the airport, offering better visibility but also exposing us more completely to detection from all directions. Around noon, Danny spotted a new concern, a plume of dust to the northeast, moving in our direction. Through binoculars, I identified the source, a military Humvee traveling at high speed across the open terrain, its path intersecting our own within minutes. "Decision time," I told the group. "We can attempt to hide and avoid contact, or signal them and hope for assistance." The choice represented everything about our new reality. The fundamental uncertainty about whether other humans represented potential salvation or additional threat. In the world before the infection, the appearance of military personnel would have automatically meant safety. Now, it could mean summary execution under quarantine protocols. "They've seen us already," Melissa noted, pointing to the vehicle's adjusted course directly toward our position. "Hiding isn't an option anymore." I made the call. Non-threatening posture, hands visible. I'll do the talking. If anything goes wrong, scatter and regroup at the airport. The Humvee approached rapidly, stopping 100 yards away. Two soldiers in full tactical gear emerged, weapons raised but not pointed directly at us. They wore protective masks covering their entire faces, making their expressions unreadable. "Stay where you are," one called through an amplified speaker. "Identify yourselves and state point of origin." "Søren Blackthorne, Sunbelt Relief Disaster Response Coordinator," I replied clearly, keeping my hands visible. 6 civilians evacuating from Phoenix. No one infected, no one bitten. We're seeking extraction to Vermilion Cliffs Research Station. The soldiers conferred briefly, then approached more closely, maintaining tactical positioning. One held what appeared to be a thermal scanner, sweeping it across our group. "Temperature normal," he reported to his companion. "No fever signatures." "You're in a red zone," the lead soldier informed us, his voice slightly more conversational, though still guarded. "How did you get this far north from Phoenix?" I explained our journey briefly, emphasizing our observations about infected behavior and evolution. The soldiers listened with increasing interest, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested our information aligned with their own experiences. "Vermilion Cliffs requested extraction 12 hours ago," the lead soldier finally said. "Current status unknown. All civilian movement to the research station has been suspended." The news confirmed my fears from the radio transmission. Whatever had happened at Vermilion Cliffs, our original destination was no longer viable. "We're heading to the regional airport extraction point," I explained. "My credentials should qualify us for evacuation." Another brief conference between the soldiers followed. "We're under orders to escort any uninfected civilians to extraction points when possible," the leader finally stated. "We can transport you, but be advised that extraction operations have been irregular. No guarantees on timing or availability." This unexpected assistance changed our calculations significantly. Vehicle transport would allow us to outpace the infected pursuing us, potentially reaching safety before being overtaken. However, it also meant surrendering control of our movement to military personnel following protocols we didn't fully understand. "We accept," I decided, recognizing that the benefits outweighed the risks in our deteriorating situation. The next hour proved the wisdom of that decision. As we traveled in the Humvee, the soldiers shared critical information about the regional situation. The infection had spread far more widely than we had realized, with major cities across the Southwest now completely overrun. Military containment efforts were failing as the infected developed new capabilities that rendered traditional defenses increasingly ineffective. Most alarming was their explanation of the classification system we had heard on the radio. Type 1s are standard infected, minimal coordination, basic hunting instincts. Type 2s show pack behavior, improved physical capabilities, and tactical adaptation. Type 3s are something else entirely: organized destruction of infrastructure, targeted elimination of communication systems, and what appears to be rudimentary planning capability. "Intelligence emerging from the collective," Dr. Reyes suggested, "a network effect as the infection spreads and more brains become incorporated into whatever hive mind is developing." The soldiers nodded grimly. "That's the working theory at command. The more infected there are, the smarter they become collectively. Each new infection adds processing capacity to the network." If accurate, this theory explained the accelerating evolution we had witnessed. Not just individual adaptations, but a genuinely emergent intelligence using infected humans as nodes in a distributed cognitive system. The implications were devastating for any hope of long-term containment or recovery. We reached the airport in mid-afternoon, finding it transformed into a heavily fortified military outpost. Concrete barriers, razor wire, and guard towers had been installed around the perimeter, with armed personnel maintaining vigilant watch in all directions. Inside this defensive ring, several helicopters and small aircraft stood ready on the tarmac, clearly prepared for rapid departure if necessary. Our escort radioed ahead, and we were admitted through a checkpoint after thorough screening for infection. The interior of the airport terminal had been converted to a military command post, with communications equipment, tactical displays, and medical screening areas replacing the usual passenger facilities. "Report to medical for full examination," our escort instructed. "After clearance, you'll be assigned temporary quarters pending extraction authorization." The medical screening was more comprehensive than I had anticipated. Blood draws, temperature monitoring, neurological testing, and detailed questioning about any potential exposure to infected individuals. Dr. Reyes engaged professionally with the military medical personnel, her expertise earning respect that helped smooth the process for our entire group. After being cleared, we were briefed on the facility protocols. Extraction flights were indeed occurring, but priority was given to military personnel, essential government employees, and individuals with specialized knowledge or skills deemed critical to ongoing response efforts. Civilians without special designation were being transported to quarantine camps behind the secondary containment line, where conditions were reportedly grim due to overwhelming numbers and limited resources. Using my disaster response credentials and Dr. Reyes's medical background, I advocated for our group to be designated as essential personnel. The communications officer seemed sympathetic but non-committal, explaining that all transport authorizations came directly from regional command. Submit your credentials and specializations, he advised. I'll forward them up the chain, but no promises. Flight operations are limited and prioritized at levels above my authority. While waiting for a decision, we were allowed access to the facility's limited amenities, actual hot food, shower facilities, and proper beds for the first time since leaving Phoenix. The relative comfort was almost disorienting after days of constant survival pressure. During this pause, I took the opportunity to document everything we had observed and learned about the infection's spread and evolution. If nothing else, this record might provide valuable information for whatever remained of organized response efforts. Dr. Reyes contributed detailed clinical observations about infected behavior patterns and physiological changes, creating a more comprehensive analysis than either of us could have produced alone. As evening approached, we gathered on an observation deck that provided views across the surrounding landscape. In the distance, columns of smoke rose from multiple locations, evidence of the firestorm protocol being implemented to create fire breaks against infected movement. More concerning were the dark shapes visible on the horizon to the south, the infected that had been pursuing us, now approaching the airport perimeter. They followed us all this way, Trevor observed, his voice a mix of fear and reluctant admiration. Even with the vehicle transport and our scent trail disrupted. They're not following our scent anymore, Dr. Reyes replied grimly. They're following a concept, the idea of us as targets, maintained in whatever distributed cognition system they've developed. A soldier approached our group, interrupting further discussion. Mr. Blackthorne, Command wants to see you and Dr. Reyes immediately. We were escorted to a secure communication room where a senior officer waited with several aides. The atmosphere was tense, professional focus barely masking underlying anxiety. Your credentials and experience have been verified, the officer began without preamble. We're implementing full evacuation of this facility within the hour. Type 3 infected have been detected approaching from multiple vectors using coordinated maneuvers we haven't seen before. You're abandoning the position? I asked, surprised by the decision to give up such a well-fortified location. Tactical withdrawal, he corrected. Type 3s have demonstrated ability to breach similar defensive structures. We're falling back to the final containment line while we still have air mobility. He turned to a tactical display showing regional deployment. Your group has been approved for priority extraction due to your disaster response expertise and Dr. Reyes's medical background. Transport leaves in 30 minutes to Colorado Springs Command Center. What about Vermilion Cliffs? I asked, still hoping for information about our original destination. The officer's expression darkened. Research station went dark 6 hours ago after reporting perimeter breach by multiple Type 3s. Extraction team found no survivors, facility compromised. Whatever they were researching there is now in infected territory. The news hit hard. Vermilion Cliffs had represented not just safety, but purpose. A location where our observations and experiences might contribute to understanding and potentially combating the infection. Its loss meant the collapse of both practical and psychological foundations of our journey. Colorado Springs is now coordinating all research efforts, the officer continued. Your documentation and observations will be valuable there. Transport for your entire group is confirmed. Gather your people and be at Hangar 3 in 20 minutes. As we prepared for evacuation, a commotion at the perimeter drew attention. Through the terminal windows, we saw infected approaching the outer defenses, dozens, then hundreds, moving with that disturbing coordination we had come to recognize. More alarming was their behavior at the barriers, not mindlessly pressing against obstacles, but systematically testing different sections, concentrating efforts at apparent weak points. They're probing the defenses, one soldier observed nervously, looking for vulnerabilities. Accelerate evacuation timeline, the senior officer ordered. all non-essential personnel on transports now. Defense teams maintain perimeter only until airlift complete, then fall back by sections. The organized withdrawal quickly became more urgent as the infected began breaching outer barriers at multiple points. Defense teams fell back in controlled retreat, maintaining just enough resistance to slow the advance without becoming surrounded. Our group was rushed to the designated hangar where a military transport helicopter waited, rotors already spinning. As we boarded, I witnessed the infected breaching the main terminal building, moving with purposeful coordination rather than mindless aggression. Most disturbing was their apparent prioritization of targets, bypassing some soldiers to attack communications equipment and fuel supplies. This wasn't random violence, but strategic neutralization of critical resources, suggesting a level of tactical thinking far beyond what infected should be capable of. The helicopter lifted off as the perimeter defenses collapsed completely. From our elevated position, the pattern became clear. The infected were systematically dismantling the airport's infrastructure, rendering it unusable for future operations. They weren't just taking the location, they were denying it to human forces with disturbing military logic. As we gained altitude, I documented the scene below, capturing the final moments of what had been a secure military position just hours earlier. The systematic nature of the infected assault had implications beyond our immediate safety. It suggested an emergent intelligence with strategic capabilities that might render traditional containment methods entirely ineffective. The helicopter banked northeast, carrying us away from the devastation below. Through the window, I could see other aircraft similarly departing, some civilian, others military, the final evacuation of organized human presence from the region. Beyond them, columns of smoke rose from implemented firestorm containment measures, creating a barrier of destruction that might temporarily slow the infected advance. Beside me, Dr. Reyes reviewed her medical notes with professional detachment that couldn't quite hide her underlying concern. "The rate of evolution is accelerating," she observed quietly. "From mindless infected to coordinated hunters to tactical thinking in just 72 hours. If the progression continues at this rate—" She didn't need to finish the thought. We both understood the implications. Whatever was driving the infection, virus, parasite, or something beyond current scientific understanding, it was adapting and evolving faster than human response could match. Each new infected individual added to its distributed intelligence, creating an adversary that learned from every encounter and failure. As darkness fell and the helicopter continued northeast, I completed my final journal entry documenting our journey from Phoenix. The 48 hours that had begun with a desperate escape from our office building had expanded into 72 hours of continuous crisis, adaptation, and increasingly narrow survival margins. We had survived when millions hadn't, reaching extraction against overwhelming odds. But the broader situation offered little cause for optimism. The infection was spreading beyond containment, evolving capabilities that rendered existing defense strategies obsolete, and potentially developing a collective intelligence that could outthink human tactical responses. What began as a simple zombie outbreak had become something far more complex and threatening. An emergent adversary using human neural architecture as building blocks for a distributed consciousness with increasingly sophisticated capabilities. The helicopter's interior lights dimmed as we crossed into Colorado airspace, the first leg of evacuation to whatever organized response remained. Around me, my exhausted companions had fallen into uneasy sleep, their faces reflecting both the trauma of what we had endured and the uncertainty of what awaited us. I closed my journal, securing the record of our journey and observations. Whether it would contribute meaningfully to understanding and combating the infection remained to be seen. But documentation had always been my response to disaster, creating order from chaos, patterns from random events, meaning from suffering. In the darkness of the helicopter cabin, one certainty remained. The world that existed before that first emergency call 72 hours ago was gone forever. Whatever emerged from this catastrophe would bear little resemblance to what came before. The question was no longer whether humanity would recover, but whether it would survive at all against an adversary that learned and evolved with every passing hour. And somewhere below us in the darkness, that adversary continued to spread, adapt, and grow more intelligent, using the neural architecture of its victims to build something entirely new and increasingly dangerous. The first 72 hours of the apocalypse had ended. The real struggle was just beginning.